The night is quiet, and the wind carries a whisper from another age. Once again, we open the pages of the past, where kings rode beneath banners of fire and faith, where stone castles rose from mist and time, and where the dreams of empires were written in moonlight and blood. This is not a tale of battle alone, but of the hearts that beat beneath the armor, the wanderers, the rulers, and the forgotten souls who built the world we now call old. So rest your thoughts, let the world outside grow still, and step softly into the glow of history's lantern. You are listening to Go to Sleep Historian, where every story drifts between truth and legend, and every whisper of the past is a lullaby for the night ahead. The boy who dreamed of a throne, far in the north, where the nights were long and the mountains breathed cold mist over the fjords. A boy was born beneath a sky of winter fire. His name was Harold Sigurdsson, but history would one day remember him as Harold Hardrada, the hard ruler. Yet in this beginning, he was only a child, quiet-eyed, watchful, the youngest brother of a fallen king. His story begins not in triumph, but in shadows. The year 1030. In a Norway torn between faith, power, and rebellion. The land was restless. Kings rose and fell as easily as tides against stone. The old gods still whispered in forests, even as church bells called for Christ. Among this divided world, Harold's half-brother, King Olaf the Stout, had once tried to unite Norway under the cross and crown. But Olaf's rule was harsh, and rebellion followed him like a storm. When Harold was just 15, that storm finally broke. The boy stood among men twice his age, armor hanging too large upon his shoulders, a sword that felt too heavy in his hand. Yet his eyes burned with something older than fear, a fierce pride, a blood-deep loyalty. He would fight beside his brother at the Battle of Stakkelstad, where Olaf sought to reclaim his lost throne from the nobles who had driven him out. The morning of battle came cloaked in fog. Somewhere in the valley below, men sang old war songs, low and mournful, their voices echoing like thunder through the hills. The scent of pine and iron filled the air. Harold's hand trembled as he gripped his sword hilt. He could hear Olaf praying quietly nearby, his voice steady even as the army of rebels gathered on the opposite slope. "Be steadfast, little brother," Olaf told him, resting a hand upon his shoulder. "If I fall, remember who we are." Those words would never leave him. The charge began with the clash of shields and the scream of steel. Harold saw men fall, men he had shared bread with only the night before. The world became sound and motion, the roar of horses, the cries of the wounded, the sudden, shocking warmth of blood upon his face. Beside him, Olaf fought like a man possessed, his golden axe rising and falling in wide, bright arcs. But the rebels were too many. A spear struck Olaf beneath his mail. The king stumbled. Harold turned to reach him, shouting, but a hammer blow caught his helm and sent him sprawling into darkness. When he awoke, the field was quiet. The rebellion had triumphed. Olaf lay among the fallen, his face strangely peaceful, as though in sleep. The boy who had dreamed of glory now knelt in the ruin of his brother's kingdom. The air smelled of smoke and sorrow. And from that moment, Harold's life would no longer belong to childhood. That night, guided by loyal men, he slipped away under cover of darkness. The roads were dangerous. Soldiers hunted for Olaf's kin, eager to stamp out his bloodline. Harold's small group of survivors fled into the mountains, traveling by hidden paths, crossing frozen rivers under the pale light of the northern moon. He carried with him not gold, not titles, only the memory of his brother's fall, and the vow that one day he would return to claim what was lost. Days turned into weeks. The snow deepened. Many who followed him perished from hunger or cold. Yet Harold pressed on, grim and silent, his spirit hardened by loss. At last, they reached the lands of the Kievan Rus, the great realm of the East, ruled by Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. There, Harold found refuge, a foreign land of domed churches, wide rivers, and markets filled with strange voices. He was just a boy, but one already tempered by war. Yaroslav, a shrewd ruler and friend to Olaf, saw potential in the young exile. He took Harold into his court, granting him safety and purpose. In Kiev, Harold learned to read and write, to speak the Slavic tongue, to wield a sword not only with strength, but with patience. The court was filled with merchants from far-off lands, Greeks, Persians, Varangians, even Arabs from the golden cities of the south. At night, Harold would stand by the Dnieper River, watching the stars shimmer upon the water. Somewhere beyond those stars lay Norway, his home, his brother's memory, and his unfinished destiny. He was no longer the frightened boy of Stakkelstad. In his silence grew resolve. Years passed. Harold served Yaroslav faithfully, commanding small bands of warriors, learning strategy, loyalty, and command. The Grand Prince treated him as both soldier and student, and in his daughter Elisiv, Harold found companionship and quiet admiration. But beneath the peace of Kiev, the north still whispered to him. He could not forget the throne stolen from his bloodline. The oath he had carried through snow and hunger still burned within him. One night, beneath the glow of an eastern moon, Harold spoke to Yaroslav of his desire to see the world, to earn glory and gold enough to one day reclaim his home. The old prince listened and nodded slowly. "You have a king's heart, young Harold," he said, "but a heart alone cannot buy a kingdom. You must forge it in fire in the east. Perhaps, where men are tested not by birth, but by deeds. And so it was decided. Harold would journey farther still, south, toward the Byzantine Empire, to the city of Miklagard, known to the world as Constantinople. There, among the emperor's guard, he would seek his fortune. The journey was long and perilous. Harold led a small company of Norse and Russ warriors down the riverways, through forests thick with mist, past trading posts and monasteries, through lands where wolves howled and bandits roamed. They carried iron swords and carved wooden idols of the saints, crossing from the cold breath of the north into the golden warmth of the south. The rivers widened. The forests gave way to open plains. And one dawn, after months of travel, Harold saw the spires and domes of Constantinople rising from the sea, a city so vast and bright that it seemed to float between worlds. The sun gleamed upon its walls of white stone, its towers crowned with crosses of gold. Ships from every corner of the earth crowded its harbors, traders, soldiers, pilgrims. Harold's heart stirred. This was no longer the world of sagas and snowy valleys. This was the center of the earth, the seat of emperors and legends. And deep within him, a voice whispered, "This is where destiny begins." In the quiet of his ship that night, Harold rode upon a small piece of hide. The boy who fled his home now sails for glory. One day, I will return not as a fugitive, but as a king. He sealed the note, tucked it into his cloak, and gazed across the dark sea. The stars were the same ones he had seen above Norway, cold, distant, eternal. But now, they reflected not the face of a boy, but of a man reborn in exile, sharpened by grief and guided by purpose. The waves rocked gently against the hull. Somewhere a gull cried out, a lonely echo in the night. Harold closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he would step into the gates of the greatest empire in the world. But tonight, he let the sea cradle him in its slow rhythm, dreaming not of battles or crowns, but of home green valleys, quiet fjords, and the brother whose name still whispered through his sleep. And so ends the first chapter of Harold's saga, a story born from loss, carried by exile, and guided by an unbreakable will. The boy of Stiklestad will soon become a soldier of Byzantium, but the heart within him still beats for Norway. Sleep now, and drift upon that same tide. For history, like the sea, always returns to its shores. The exile prince, when the snows of winter melted across the plains of the east, and the Dnieper River shimmered under a silver dawn, Harold Sigurdsson stood at the edge of a new life. He was no longer the frightened boy who had fled from Stiklestad. Months of exile had stripped away the softness of youth, leaving in its place a quiet, watchful strength. His hands bore the rough scars of travel, his face the calm stillness of one who had looked into loss and learned endurance. The world of the north, the dark fjords and pine forests of Norway, seemed far away now, like a fading dream. Ahead lay Kievan Rus, the realm of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, a land where the old Norsemen had become lords, traders, and warriors in service of the East. Yaroslav's court was unlike anything Harold had ever known. The prince ruled from a great wooden hall in Kiev, its beams carved with dragons, its hearths burning bright even in daylight. The air was filled with the mingled scent of wax and pine, of parchment and mead. There were voices from every corner of the world, Norse mercenaries speaking their rough northern tongue, Greek envoys in embroidered robes, Slavic priests chanting softly in the corner. It was here that the young exile first learned the art of patience, the stillness that lies beneath strength. Yaroslav, who had once sheltered Harold's brother Olaf, looked upon him with interest. The boy's story had already traveled far. The king's brother who had escaped death, the young warrior who carried both pride and pain in his eyes. He welcomed Harold into his service not as a prince, but as a soldier among the Varangians, those wandering Norsemen who had come to the east seeking fortune and adventure. Life in Kiev was both harsh and beautiful. In the mornings, Harold trained with the warriors, tall men from the fjords and islands of the north, their shields painted with symbols of their homes. He learned new ways to fight, new weapons, and the disciplined formations of the Rus. He learned the language of the Slavs, the prayers of the Orthodox monks, and the rules of trade that bound the rivers together like veins of silver. By night, the halls filled with music, harps, flutes, the low chanting of songs that spoke of faraway coasts and lost comrades. Harold often stood by the river, gazing at the moon reflected upon the slow-moving water. The nights were longer here, yet somehow softer than the nights of Norway. He would whisper to himself the names of those he had lost, Olaf, his friends, his homeland, as though the wind might carry them home. But even in peace, Harold remained restless. He fought in Yaroslav's service, defending trade routes, quelling raids, leading small expeditions through forests where snow lay deep and wolves howled from the shadows. In battle, he moved with cold precision, not reckless, but steady, his mind always turning toward a greater purpose. And slowly, his reputation grew. Men began to speak of the young Norse exile who never yielded, who carried himself not like a soldier, but like a man born to rule. Yaroslav noticed this too. In the boy's quiet manner, he saw ambition, not greed, but a sense of destiny. The prince's daughters often attended court, draped in silks and veils, their hair adorned with small rings of gold. Among them was Elisev, the youngest, gentle, thoughtful, and curious about the world beyond the palace walls. She would listen as Harold told stories of Norway, of frozen lakes that glittered like glass, of mountains that touched the sky, and of his brother, the fallen king who had dreamed of uniting his people. Perhaps in those moments, something tender began to grow, a shared longing for a world larger than the one they knew. But Harold was not yet ready to rest. His eyes were always drawn southward, toward the horizon where the rivers met the sea. One evening, as the hall quieted and the candles burned low, Yaroslav summoned him. The prince's face was half lit by the glow of the hearth. "You have served me faithfully, Harold Sigurdsson," he said, "and I have watched you grow from a wounded boy into a man of iron. But your heart is not here." Harold bowed his head. "My heart," he said softly, "belongs to Norway." Yaroslav nodded slowly. "Then you must make it worthy of a crown. The world is wide, and there are places where gold and glory flow like rivers. Go south, to Miklagard. The emperor of the Greeks pays well for men who fight with courage." He paused, then smiled faintly. "And when you have earned enough gold and fame, come back to claim what is yours." The decision was made. In the early spring, Harold gathered a company of warriors, Norsemen, Russ, and men of mixed blood from the riverlands. They built longships strong enough for the southern waters and filled them with supplies: salted fish, mead, arrows, and hope. Elisive came to see him off. The morning mist hung over the river, soft and pale. She handed him a small silver cross, a gift from her father's chapel. "For luck," she said. Harold took it, his hand brushing hers. "For memory," he whispered. Then, with the cry of gulls overhead and the creak of oars, the ships drifted into the current, the city of Kiev fading behind them like a vision swallowed by fog. The voyage south was long and filled with peril. They sailed down the Dnieper River, through lands of forests and open plains, where tribes watched from the banks and arrows sometimes whistled through the air. They hauled their ships over rapids, their hands raw from ropes and stone, but the journey itself changed them. The cold, gray north gave way to sunlight that warmed their faces, two lands rich with olive groves and vineyards. The scent of salt grew stronger in the wind. And then, one morning, they saw it, Constantinople, rising from the sea like a dream carved from marble and gold. The first sight of Miklagard stunned them all. Its walls stretched for miles, glimmering in the sunlight. Domes of copper and silver crowned the skyline. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia caught the dawn light and sent it cascading across the water in waves of color. Ships from every kingdom crowded the harbor: Greek galleys, Arab dhows, Viking longships, and strange vessels with sails of red and green. Harold stood at the prow of his ship, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, the wind in his hair. "This," he murmured, "is where kings are made." When he stepped ashore, the air smelled of spices and incense. Merchants shouted in a dozen tongues. Monks walked in long black robes. The city pulsed with life, a crossroads of empires. Harold and his men made their way to the imperial barracks, where the Varangian guard trained. These were warriors like himself, men from the north, hired to serve as the emperor's personal protectors. They spoke his language, though their accents were softened by years under southern skies. They welcomed him as one of their own. And so, in the heart of Byzantium, Harold Sigurdsson, exile of Norway, brother of a fallen king, became a soldier once more. But now, he served not for survival, but for destiny. At night, he would walk the marble streets of Constantinople, past fountains and gardens lit by oil lamps. He would hear the sound of hymns drifting from distant churches, and the laughter of sailors in the taverns near the docks. Sometimes, he would take from his pouch the small silver cross that Elisive had given him and hold it against his palm. It reminded him that even here, among strangers in splendor, he carried a piece of home. In the stillness of those warm nights, Harold would gaze across the dark sea, thinking of Norway, of snow, pine, and silence. The boy who had fled into exile had become a man of purpose. Yet the path before him still wound through shadow and storm. His name would soon echo through the halls of emperors. But in his heart, he was still that boy at Stiklestad, chasing a throne he had once lost in blood and sorrow. And so, the exile prince steps into the empire of the south, where gold glitters, secrets whisper, and the north wind follows him still. Sleep now, dear viewer. The journey has just begun. The journey to the east, the cold air of the northern forests, still clung to Harold's cloak when he first spoke of leaving Russ. He had spent years in exile, sharpening his sword and his patience, under the watchful eyes of Prince Yaroslav. The boy who had once fled Norway's defeat was now taller, broader, and older in spirit than his years should have allowed. Yet within him burned something restless, a quiet hunger for greatness that no peaceful court could satisfy. There were nights when the fires in Yaroslav's hall would burn low, and Harold would sit apart from the laughter of the princes and their guests. His thoughts wandered to distant lands beyond the river's lands, whispered about by merchants and warriors who had seen the world's edge. They spoke of a city of gold and marble, where kings bowed before an emperor, and where the sea itself glittered with trade. They called it Miklagard, the great city known to the Greeks as Constantinople. It was said that those who served there, in the army of the emperor, could earn riches beyond imagining. The stories told of the Varangian Guard, tall northern warriors sworn to protect the emperor himself, men whose loyalty was sealed not by birth, but by blood and oath. Harold listened, and in his silence, the seed of destiny took root. When spring came, he went to Yaroslav. The prince received him warmly, for he had grown fond of this fierce young Norseman, who had become almost like a son. Harold spoke with respect, yet his voice carried the weight of purpose. "I thank you for your shelter," he said, "and for your wisdom. But my heart is not made for stillness. I must go where the fates call me, to the great city in the south." Yaroslav studied him for a long moment. "You seek glory?" Then Harold smiled faintly. "I seek what waits for me." And so the prince gave him his blessing, as well as gold, a ship, and a handful of men who would follow him through fire if he asked. The journey began upon the wide rivers of the rust-dark waters winding between endless forests and marshland. The wind carried the cries of distant birds, the groan of oars, and the creak of ships sliding over the current. They passed wooden forts, trading posts, and the settlements of the Slavs and Finns. Harold learned the rhythm of travel, long days of rowing, quiet nights, by the fire, the stars guiding them ever southward. At times, the rivers grew narrow, choked with reeds. The men hauled their vessels overland, dragging them across muddy earth to the next stream. It was a world of sweat and patience, a world that tested even the strongest. But Harold never wavered. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the rivers would one day open into the Black Sea, and beyond that, into legend. Weeks passed. The air grew warmer, the forests gave way to plains, and the scent of salt began to drift across the wind. They had reached the land of the Greeks, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. When at last the spires of Constantinople rose before them, Harold and his men fell silent. Even the sea seemed to hush in awe. The city was unlike anything they had imagined, towers of shining stone, walls that seemed to stretch to the heavens, and domes that caught the sunlight like fire. Great ships crowded the harbor, their sails striped with color, while the voices of 100 tongues filled the air. Harold's men, hardened by years of battle and travel, stared as though seeing a dream. This was no wooden hall of the north. This was the center of the world. As they entered the city, the scent of incense and spice enveloped them. Gold mosaics gleamed from the church walls. Soldiers in bronze armor marched in perfect rhythm through marble streets. Everywhere was the sound of bells, the chant of priests, and the endless hum of life. Harold found his way to the imperial palace, for men of strength and courage were always in demand. He stood before the emperor's captains, tall and fierce, his voice calm but unyielding. He offered his sword for service, his loyalty for a place among the Varangian Guard. They tested him, of course, with the blade, the shield, and the oath. And when he stood victorious among them, they knew he was no ordinary wanderer. His Norse name was difficult for the Greeks to pronounce, so they gave him a new one, Aralt's, the northern warrior. Life in Byzantium was unlike the north in every way. The palace glittered with gold and silk, but its beauty hid 1,000 intrigues. Servants whispered secrets in the corridors, and the emperor's court was a place where words could wound more sharply than swords. Harold observed, learned, and kept his silence. But when battle called, he became once more the man of the north. He marched with the guard across the sea to Sicily, to Asia Minor, even to the Holy Land. He fought pirates, rebels, and armies far from home. His axe became known among the Greeks as the wolf's bite, and his courage drew both respect and envy. The years passed, and gold flowed into his coffers like a river. Yet even amid the luxury, Harold remained distant. He watched as other men became soft with ease, but his heart never forgot the snows of Norway, or the shadow of his brother's fall. There were whispers that the emperor himself grew wary of the northern warrior who had become too admired by his own men. Some said Harold's loyalty was too strong, others that his ambition was too great. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. Then came a night of betrayal. The palace was lit with torches, the sound of steel echoing in the corridors. Orders were shouted. Harold was to be imprisoned, whether for pride, politics, or fear, no one could say. But even chains could not hold him long. In the dark of the dungeon, he waited, silent as a storm. The men who still owed him loyalty, his Varangian brothers, planned their move. And one night, when the guards changed and the sea wind howled, they struck. They cut their bonds, fought through the halls, and reached the harbor. There, in the moonlight, ships waited. Harold's eyes shone with that cold, determined light his enemies had learned to fear. "Open the chain," he said, for across the harbor mouth, a great iron chain barred the way. With axes and fire, they shattered it. Their ships lunged forward into the dark sea, sails snapping in the wind. Behind them, the lights of Constantinople burned like stars fading into dawn. The Varangian who had defied emperors was free again. He left behind a city of gold and deceit, but took with him the wealth and legend of a lifetime. And somewhere on that long road north, as the waves carried him home, Harold thought of Norway, the kingdom he had lost and the throne that had waited too long. In the whisper of the wind, he could almost hear his brother's voice. In the gleam of the stars, he saw the reflection of crowns yet unwon. The sea stretched before him vast and silent, and the world felt open once more. Not as it had when he fled in fear, but as it should for a man who was finally ready to claim his destiny. And so the long road east had come full circle. The exile who had left in shadow now returned with the light of 1,000 fires behind him, a prince reborn, a wanderer no more. The waves whispered beneath the keel of his ship as the dawn broke across the horizon. The path ahead lay toward home, toward Norway, toward fate. And so the long road east carried Harold toward the life that awaited him, not as a soldier, but as a king who would one day shake the very thrones of Europe. The Emperor's Guard, the sea, carried Harold southward, into waters brighter and warmer than any he had ever known. The sun above the Mediterranean shimmered like molten gold, and the air itself seemed scented with faraway spices. For a man raised among icy fjords and shadowed valleys, this world was like a dream. Yet beneath his calm eyes, the heart of a warrior still burned, restless, searching, waiting for its purpose. They called it Miklagard, the great city. To the Greeks, it was Constantinople, jewel of the east, where marble domes touched the sky and the sea walls gleamed in morning light. Harold had heard tales of it since his boyhood, whispered by traders and seafarers who spoke of its splendor and its strange, ordered peace. When his ship at last entered the great harbor, he felt as if he had sailed into the heart of a legend. The harbor itself was alive, not with the shouting chaos of a northern port, but with a measured rhythm, like a vast machine of human intent. Galleys glided across the water, their prows carved with eagles and dragons. Slaves unloaded amphorae of wine and oil, merchants called in 6 languages, and the purple banners of the emperor fluttered in the soft wind. For the first time since leaving his homeland, Harold felt small, not diminished, but awed. He was a wolf stepping into the marble lair of lions. The Varangians, the famed northern guards who served the emperor himself, stood in ranks near the harbor gates. They were men like Harold, tall, broad-shouldered, their faces pale from northern winters, their axes gleaming under the eastern sun. They were sworn not to their own kings, but to the emperor of Byzantium, protectors of his throne and his life. Harold approached their captain, a grizzled man named Thorstein, whose eyes studied him like a craftsman judging the strength of iron. Harold offered no bow, no humble words, only his name and the steel of his gaze. "Harold Sigurdsson," he said. "I seek service under the emperor." The captain smiled faintly, as if he'd been expecting him. "Another wolf from the north. Good. The emperor sleeps easier when his guards remember the cold." And so, Harold joined the Varangian Guard. Life in Constantinople was unlike anything he had ever known. The city glowed even at night, with lamps burning fragrant oils along the streets. Minstrels played in the courtyards, and merchants argued over silks, pearls, and spices. Everywhere was order, the order of wealth, of empire, of quiet power. But within the palace walls, there was another world entirely, one of whispers, secrets, and invisible battles. The Emperor's Guard was not only a force of warriors, it was a wall of silence. They were trusted with what others could not even speak aloud. Harold learned quickly. He learned to salute in the Roman fashion, to bow before the emperor's throne, and to stand motionless for hours beside the golden mosaics of the palace. He learned their tongue, strange and soft compared to Norse, and found that even words could be weapons if wielded well. Yet no matter how many ceremonies he attended or how many coins he earned, he remained apart. When the Byzantines looked at him, they saw not a man, but a symbol, a foreign sword with ice in its veins. And Harold, he saw them as dreamers guarding a fragile paradise. For in his heart, he still carried the wild winds of Norway, and the ghost of a brother slain for a crown. The empire soon learned his worth. In the years that followed, Harold fought not just for gold, but for glory. He led campaigns in Sicily and Jerusalem, marching beneath banners of Christ and Caesar. He saw deserts where the air shimmered like fire, and mountains where monks carved prayers into the rock. He watched empires crumble, and he watched the Byzantine army stand unbroken, an ancient beast that devoured its enemies with patient strength. Stories spread through the ranks of a northern commander who never faltered, whose sword flashed like lightning, whose courage seemed touched by the old gods. The Greeks called him Aralts, a name half misheard, half made in awe. And though the years turned, Harold's hunger for greatness never dimmed. He grew wealthy, rich enough to buy ships of his own. He grew wise, learning that power was not always taken by blade, but often by timing, silence, and understanding. But with wisdom came restlessness. For every night he stood guard in the golden halls. He dreamed of home, of the cold mountains of Norway, the scent of pine and sea, and the throne that had once been denied him. When he looked upon the emperor, jeweled and still upon his seat, Harold saw not majesty but captivity. He saw what it meant to win everything and yet lose freedom. It was in those quiet nights that Harold's legend began to take shape. He was no longer merely a refugee or a soldier. He had become something larger, a man born of two worlds, one of northern frost, the other of eastern fire. His comrades whispered that he was touched by destiny, that no chain could hold him for long. Even the emperor's courtiers, cautious and proud, began to speak his name with respect. And yet, those who watched closely saw that his eyes always lingered northward, as if measuring distance, waiting for the moment when fate would turn its gaze upon him again. The Byzantines had their riches, their palaces, their endless ceremonies. Harold had something rarer, memory and ambition. He had crossed seas. He had guarded emperors. But he had not yet claimed the one thing that had driven him since boyhood, the crown of Norway. And so, when word came from the north of shifting kings, of unrest, of opportunity, Harold knew the time had come. He gathered his treasure, his men, and the blessings of fortune. From Constantinople's shining harbor, his ships once again turned toward the wind. The same waters that had carried him into empire would now carry him home. As the city faded behind him, he looked once more upon its glowing walls. He had entered them as a wanderer. He left them as a legend. The sea ahead was vast and unknown, but his purpose was clear as moonlight on the waves. He was going home not as the boy who fled a broken kingdom, but as the man who would seize it. And so, Harold sailed once more into the north wind, toward the land of his fathers, and the destiny that still waited, cold and unclaimed. The gold in the cross, the long northern summer was just beginning when Harold's ships drifted into the quiet waters of the Dnieper River. Behind him lay Byzantium, the city of marble and intrigue. Ahead stretched the long green world of the Rus, and beyond that, the endless road home. The sails flapped softly in the morning wind. Mist rose from the river banks where the trees leaned low, their leaves trembling over the water like thin fingers brushing a mirror. For the first time in many years, Harold breathed the scent of the northern pines again. It was the smell of home, though Norway was still far away. His ships carried more than warriors now. They carried treasure, gold, and silver from distant palaces, jeweled icons, silks, and strange relics of the East. Some said Harold had taken it as pay from the emperor. Others whispered it was plunder from campaigns and clever schemes. Whatever the truth, it was enough to buy loyalty, to raise armies, and perhaps even to buy a crown. But gold alone could not calm the storm inside him. Years of exile had hardened him, yet they had also deepened the quiet spaces within his soul. He had fought for emperors, guarded thrones, and outlived comrades who once laughed with him by campfires. Now, as the river carried his ships north, Harold felt both rich and strangely hollow, a man full of stories, yet unsure which one was truly his. In the evenings, the crew would anchor near the riverbank. They would light small fires and roast fish caught from the stream. Around the flames, they sang low songs in the language of the north, songs that sounded like waves breaking against cold rocks. Harold would listen in silence, sometimes touching the golden cross that hung at his chest, a gift from a priest in Constantinople. He had taken the cross years ago, partly out of respect, partly out of habit. But now, as he stared into the darkening sky, he wondered what it truly meant. He had prayed beside Greek monks, seen miracles of stone and light in Hagia Sophia, and watched men kill and die under banners that bore the same sacred sign. The cross gleamed faintly in the firelight, neither condemning nor comforting. Some nights, Harold dreamed of his brother Olaf, Saint Olaf now, as the church called him. He saw him standing barefoot in a field of mist, his sword lowered, his eyes kind and sad. In the dream, Olaf said nothing, only looked at him as though waiting for an answer Harold had never given. When he awoke, the world was always still. The morning sun would break through the fog, and the river would whisper like the voice of something ancient. Harold would rise and command his men forward, his face unreadable. But deep within, he knew the question would not leave him. What kind of king would he be? One ruled by vengeance, or one guided by faith? The journey north was long and filled with shadows of the past. In Kiev, he was welcomed by Yaroslav the Wise, the Grand Prince of the Rus. It was here, many years before, that Harold had once sought refuge after the fall of his brother. Now he returned not as a fugitive, but as a man of legend, the warrior who had fought for emperors and outlived them. Yaroslav received him with honor. The prince was older now, his hair silver, his halls rich with Byzantine art and Norse runes. They dined together on roasted venison and honeyed wine. "You left here as a boy," said Yaroslav, smiling. "You return as a man of power. But tell me, Harold, what do you seek now?" Harold looked into the cup of wine in his hand. The red surface trembled, reflecting the torchlight like a pool of blood. "I seek what was lost," he said. "A kingdom, perhaps. A name. A peace that lasts longer than a victory." Yaroslav nodded slowly. "Peace is harder to win than any war, and crowns weigh heavier than helmets." They both laughed softly, but the truth lingered in the air like the aftertaste of smoke. During his stay in Kiev, Harold met Elisiv, Yaroslav's daughter, a woman whose beauty was quiet, not made of jewels or ceremony, but of grace. She spoke little, yet her eyes seemed to hold both curiosity and calm. In her presence, Harold felt something rare, stillness. They would walk together through the palace gardens at dusk, where the scent of lilacs drifted on the air. Elisiv listened as he spoke of his journeys, of deserts, seas, and cities where the walls shone like gold. When he faltered, she said simply, "And still, you came home." Those words stayed with him. In the autumn of that year, they were married. The wedding was simple, held in a small stone church where candlelight shimmered on ancient icons. The priests sang in Greek and Old Church Slavonic. The air was thick with incense. Harold wore a cloak woven with silver threads, and on his brow, a narrow band of gold. Not a crown yet, but something that foretold it. When he took Elisiv's hand, he felt a strange calm settle over him, as if some unseen part of his life had finally found its anchor. For the first time in years, the restless warrior felt something close to peace. Yet peace, for men like Harold, was never meant to last. Winter came early. Snow blanketed the city, muffling sound and softening the edges of the world. Harold would stand at the palace window, watching flakes drift through the torchlight, and his mind would wander north to Norway. He pictured its fjords, dark and cold, its villages clinging to the coasts, its people living under foreign rulers. Norway had a king still, Magnus the Good, son of Olaf, Harold's own nephew. The boy had grown into a ruler, fair and just, but young. The country was stable, yet fragile, like ice too thin to walk upon. One evening, Harold spoke to Elisiv as the fire crackled low. "There is a storm coming," he said, "and I can't stay here while another man sits on Norway's throne." Elisiv looked at him quietly. "Magnus is your kin. Would you make war upon your own blood?" "I would make peace, if peace could be made," he answered softly, "but I will not die forgotten." She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his calloused skin. "Then go. But remember what you've learned in the south, that strength is not only in the sword, but in mercy." Her words lingered like a candle's glow in his heart. When the snows melted and the rivers ran high with spring, Harold prepared his fleet. He loaded his ships with gold, with warriors from Rus, and with dreams that gleamed brighter than any treasure. The people of Kiev watched as the sails unfurled white against the blue sky, and whispered that the north wind itself seemed to bow before him. Yaroslav stood upon the docks as Harold departed. "You go to claim what is yours?" he said, "but remember, the gods grant kingship only to those who can rule their own hearts." Harold nodded, the words settling deep inside him. As the ships glided down the river, the city of Kiev faded behind him. The wind carried the scent of pine and water. Elisiv stood at the stern beside him, her hair fluttering like a banner. Ahead lay the long road home, and the throne that had haunted his dreams since boyhood. The crew sang softly, their voices rising and falling with the waves. Harold listened, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, the golden cross glinting against his chest. It was both a burden and a promise, a reminder that the man returning to Norway was not the same one who had left it. The boy who once fled defeat had become something else entirely, forged by exile, sharpened by empire, and tempered by love. As the last light of day faded, Harold looked to the northern horizon. The stars began to appear one by one, their reflections shimmering on the black surface of the river. He smiled faintly. "The gold will buy my army," he murmured, "but the cross will test my soul." The oars dipped in rhythm, the water whispered against the hulls, and the night deepened around them. And so, with the bride beside him, with faith upon his chest and gold in his hold, Harold Sigurdsson, the man who had been exile, mercenary, and Varangian, turned his face once more toward home. And the rivers carried him northward, toward the land of his birth, where old oaths awaited, and the crown of Norway shimmered faintly in the mist of memory. Shadows over England, the sea once again lay before him, cold, gray, and endless. For most men, it was a boundary. For Harold Hardrada, it was a promise. Years had passed since he claimed Norway's crown. The fjords echoed now not with rebellion, but with order. Trade flowed, the farms were guarded, and the land bowed beneath his steady rule. Yet peace was a cloak that never fit him comfortably. He had lived too long by the edge of a sword to find rest in silence. When he stood upon the cliffs and watched the gulls wheel over the horizon, his mind wandered to the stories of old, of his forefathers who had ruled not just Norway, but the whole northern sea. The empire of Canute, the great Denmark, Norway, and England bound under one crown, was gone, scattered like ashes on the tide. But Harold still dreamed of it. And dreams, for him, were never things to be left sleeping. Rumors came first. Carried by merchants from across the North Sea, they spoke of England's troubles, a king growing old without an heir, nobles whispering of succession, and foreign claimants sharpening their blades in secret. King Edward of England, the Confessor, was a man of faith and frailty. He ruled more with prayer than power. The nobles around him grew restless, their ambitions rising like weeds in an untended garden. To Harold, it was a tale he had heard many times before, a kingdom divided, waiting for the man bold enough to seize it. He had fought for gold, for loyalty, for revenge. But England called to him with something deeper. It was not only a crown he sought, but legacy. The North Sea had long bound the fates of his people to that green island. Viking kings had ruled there before. His own brother Olaf had claimed it by right of treaty. And Magnus the Good, before his death, had sworn that England should fall to his line, to Harold's line, if ever it stood unguarded again. Now, the throne stood open, trembling between hands too weak to hold it. And so the thought took root. England was not someone else's kingdom. It was a birthright unclaimed. Harold spoke little of his plans, but those who knew him saw the old fire kindling again. His steps grew longer, his gaze sharper, his council meetings restless. He began to summon old allies, jarls, warriors, shipbuilders, the men who owed him blood and gold. The longships of Norway stirred once more. Along the fjords, hammers rang against oak, and iron sails were stitched, shields painted. The scent of pine and tar filled the air. To the people, It was clear their king was preparing for something vast. But where most men prepared for war with loud proclamations, Harold prepared in silence. He was older now, grayer around the temples, but his will had only hardened with the years. He moved like a man who had seen too much of life to waste breath on promises. When asked why he would cross the sea once more, he answered simply, "Because the sea remembers my name." One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the fjords glowed red with its dying light, a visitor came to Harold's hall. He was tall, fair-haired, his cloak dusty from long travel. He bowed before the king and gave his name, Tostig Godwinson, brother to Harold, the earl who now ruled England in the confessor's stead. Tostig's eyes were sharp, his voice heavy with resentment. Cast out by his own kin, he had wandered north in search of allies and revenge. "My brother has stolen my lands," Tostig said, his tone bitter as salt. "He wears a crown that was never his by right. He rules with deceit, not strength. Help me reclaim what is mine, and I will help you claim what is yours, the throne of England itself." The firelight flickered in Harold's eyes. He did not answer at once. Instead, he watched the flames dance, the crackle of pine filling the hall like the whispers of fate. Two brothers, one ruling England, the other cast out. A kingdom divided by pride and blood. It was the kind of story that always ended in battle, and Harold had always been the man to write the final chapter. At last, he spoke. "If I go to England," he said, "it will not be for another man's revenge. It will be for my destiny." Tostig smiled, slow and cunning. "Then let our destinies meet on the same field, King Harold." And so, an alliance was forged, one born not of friendship, but of shared hunger. The summer that followed was restless. Across Norway, men whispered of the great fleet being built in secret. Some said 300 ships, others more. The dragon-prowed longships glided from the fjords like shadows, their sails dark as storm clouds. Every harbor echoed with preparation, blacksmiths hammering armor, women sewing banners, children watching in awe, as the king's warriors gathered in ranks. Harold walked among them, quiet and steady. His voice carried calm, not fire. He spoke of duty, of fate, of the greatness of their ancestors who had once ruled from the fjords to the English hills. The old songs returned to the air, mingling with the creak of rope and the rush of tide. And as the fleet grew, so did the sense that something vast was about to awaken, not merely an army, but the last heartbeat of the Viking Age itself. When the day came to sail, the sea was calm, as if the gods themselves had stilled the waves to watch. The ships lined the coast in ranks, their carved prows glinting in the pale sun. The men stood ready, their shields bright, their spirits high. Harold climbed aboard his flagship, the Land Waster, its decks polished and its mast painted with symbols of Odin's ravens. He looked back at the land of Norway, the mountains rising like old guardians behind him. "Take care of my kingdom," he told the men left behind. "If I do not return, let the North remember that its king went to meet his fate as a warrior." Then he raised his hand, and the horns sounded deep, mournful, echoing across the water. The oars struck the waves in perfect rhythm. 300 ships moved as one, their sails swelling with the wind. The last great Viking army had set sail. For days the fleet sailed across the North Sea through fog, wind, and silence. The men sang to keep rhythm, the same old songs their fathers had sung when they crossed these waters in search of glory. The sound of oars and voices carried far into the gray. When land finally rose on the horizon, it was green and low England, waiting beneath a veil of mist. Harold stood at the prow, his cloak snapping in the wind, his eyes fixed on the shore. It had been many years since he'd first dreamed of a crown. Now, it shimmered just beyond the waves. The gods had given him strength, victory, and survival, but never rest. And in that moment, he knew he would not find peace on this side of the sea. And so, the north wind crossed once more into the land of kings and destiny, toward the fields of England, where history itself would soon draw its sword. The battle for the north, the English coast, lay quiet beneath a pale September sky. The tide lapped softly against the sand, as if unsure whether to welcome or warn the ships that now darkened the horizon. 300 longships drifted toward the shore, their sails heavy with northern wind. From a distance, they looked like the wings of a vast dark bird sweeping in from the sea, a creature born of ambition and storm. The men aboard them were the finest Harold Hardrada had ever led, veterans of 100 campaigns, men who had fought under the burning sun of the east and the frozen moons of the north. They rowed with calm, practiced strokes, their eyes fixed on the green land that promised both glory and death. When the first keels struck the sand, silence broke. Helmets gleamed, swords caught the light, and the banners of the Raven were lifted high. Harold stood tall at the shore, the wind pulling at his cloak, his gaze unflinching. "This is England," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and it will remember us." Their first steps on English soil were not met with resistance, only the whisper of the fields and the cry of distant crows. They advanced inland, raiding and gathering supplies, moving swiftly up the rivers that cut through the countryside. Villages surrendered. Farmers offered food in tribute, their loyalty traded for mercy. At their side rode Tostig Godwinson, Harold's unlikely ally, the exiled English noble who knew every road, every ford, every noble house that might bend or break. His anger at his brother had hardened into a cold determination. To him, this invasion was not conquest, but vengeance. Together, they marched toward the north, toward the great city of York, heart of the old Enola, where Norse blood still ran in the veins of many. Harold's army moved like a tide. The long banners fluttered in the wind. The hum of song rose at night beside the campfires. There was no haste, no fear, only that strange calm that comes when warriors believe their fate has already been written. The scouts brought word. The northern earls, Edwin of Mercia and Mercar of Northumbria, had gathered an army to oppose them. Thousands strong, they waited by the river Ouse, near the village of Fulford. Harold smiled when he heard it. At last, he said, England has found its courage. The morning of battle dawned bright and cold. Mist hung over the river, coiling low around the reeds and stones. The English army had taken position near the water's edge, their spears glittering like frost in the sun. Harold's men formed ranks opposite them, shields interlocked, the raven banners fluttering above their heads. The air was still, filled only with the soft creak of leather, the rustle of armor, and the faint cry of gulls circling overhead. For a moment, both sides stood silent, two armies staring across the meadow, as though across time itself, the old world of the Vikings facing the new kingdom of the English. Then, with a shout that rolled like thunder over the plain, the Norsemen advanced. The ground trembled beneath their charge. Spears met shields, and the clash rang out across the fields. The air filled with the sound of iron and the cries of men. Harold's veterans moved like a storm front, their axes biting deep, their discipline breaking the English line again and again. The battle swayed, wild and brutal. At times, the river ran red, its current pulling away the fallen. Harold himself rode among his men, his great frame unmistakable, his armor catching the light. He fought not as a distant king, but as one of them, calm, fierce, unstoppable. By afternoon, the English ranks wavered. Edwin's line broke first, then Morcar's. The field became a rout. The Norsemen pressed forward, driving the defenders into the marshes and rivers. When it was over, the ground was silent again, littered with broken spears, torn banners, and the echoes of courage. York lay open before them. The gates of the city did not resist. The citizens of York, seeing the fate of the northern earls, opened their gates, and offered hostages, pledging to accept Harold as king. For the first time in weeks, the army rested, the wounded were tended, the dead burned with songs. Harold walked through the quiet streets of York, the smoke of victory still clinging to the air. He did not gloat, he did not boast. To him, this victory was simply one more step toward destiny. The people watched him pass, tall, gray, cloaked in deep blue. There was something otherworldly about him, as though he carried not just the weight of kingship, but the shadow of the past itself. At night, he sat by the fire outside the city walls. Around him, the soldiers feasted, their laughter echoing under the stars. Yet Harold remained silent, his gaze fixed on the flames. One of his captains approached. "You are troubled, my king," the man said softly. Harold's eyes reflected the firelight. "Victory," he murmured, "is a fleeting guest. It comes swiftly, and leaves sooner than one expects." The wind rustled through the camp, carrying with it the distant scent of rain. Somewhere in that wind, perhaps, was the first faint whisper of warning. The next morning, messengers arrived. They brought news that no one expected. The English king, Harold Godwinson, Tostig's brother, had marched north. In a single, astonishing week, he had gathered his army in the south, abandoned the southern coast where the Normans waited, and forced his men on a grueling march of nearly 200 miles. He was already close, closer than anyone believed possible. The Norse camp stirred uneasily. Some thought it rumor, others divine omen, but Harold knew better. He looked toward the horizon, where the clouds thickened like smoke. "He comes," he said quietly. "The true battle is upon us." He ordered part of the fleet to sail back down the river with supplies, the rest to guard their retreat if needed. Many of his men had laid down their armor after Fulford, believing the campaign was won. Harold told them to rest, but keep their weapons near. Still, no one truly believed an army could arrive so quickly. But the gods of the north had always loved sudden turns of fate. As dawn broke 2 days later, word came that the English were near, closer than any had feared. Harold's scouts rode hard into camp, shouting warnings. King Harold Godwinson had arrived. His men were crossing the fields beyond Stamford Bridge. Harold stood, the wind tugging at his cloak, his face calm. "So be it," he said. "Let England and Norway settle their claim beneath the same sky." He donned his armor, the shining mail gifted to him in Byzantium, said to be proof against any blade. His men gathered their shields and axes, many still without helmets or full armor. The sun climbed higher, and the quiet valley near Stamford Bridge filled with the sound of preparation, steel meeting wood, hearts steadying for the last great clash of the Viking Age. And so, the north wind that had swept from the fjords to the English fields now met its equal. The air before battle was still, heavy with fate. For by sunset, one Harold would fall, and an age would end forever. The last battle. The morning rose clear and bright over the valley of Stamford Bridge. Mist clung to the low grass, curling like smoke beneath the sunlight. It was a morning too beautiful for battle, the kind that makes a man forget death, even as it waits just beyond the hill. The Norse camp stirred slowly, unaware that fate had already arrived. Some men washed their hands in the river, others sat sharpening axes, speaking softly of home. Their laughter drifted across the meadow, gentle and untroubled. Then came the sound, faint at first, like distant thunder. The ground trembled. A great dark line appeared on the horizon, shimmering in the morning heat. The English had come. Their banners, golden and white, rippled in the sunlight. Thousands of men, archers, housecarls, and the fierce fyrd of the shires, marching with the steady rhythmic sound of steel on earth. King Harold Godwinson rode at their head, his golden mustache glinting in the sun, his armor plain and functional. He had no need for splendor. He was the King of England, and this was his home. The first alarm cry rose through the Norse camp. Men scrambled for weapons, calling out names, fastening armor, shouting orders that dissolved in the sudden chaos. Harold Hardrada stepped from his tent, calm amid the noise. His tall frame seemed to cut through the morning light, his blue cloak flowing behind him. He looked upon the valley, the distant English ranks, the glimmer of steel, the sure approach of destiny, and said softly, "At last, the storm is here." His men rushed to form lines, but many had left their armor by the ships or back at York. Some wore only shirts, others hastily donned helmets or carried shields borrowed from fallen comrades. The heat of the sun grew stronger, the air heavy with fear and sweat. Still, Harold's voice rose over the confusion, deep and commanding. "Hold the bridge, hold it till the rest come." He placed a handful of warriors to guard the narrow crossing over the river, went the only way by which the English could advance. Then, gathering those ready for battle, he moved to the far side, forming ranks upon the open field. For a time, the bridge held. A single Norse warrior, his name lost to time, stood alone upon the planks, facing the entire English vanguard. With axe in hand, he blocked the passage, cutting down all who dared to cross. The story says he slew 40 men before they brought him down, pierced from below by a spear through the gaps in the wood. But his courage gave Harold precious minutes. The rest of the Norse host arrived, forming a great shield wall across the meadow. Round shields overlapped like scales of a dragon, bright axes glinting above them. Harold rode along the front, his voice steady, his eyes alight with a strange calm. "We came to claim a crown," he said, "and the crown of battle is the one the gods offer first." The men roared in reply, not in anger, but in pride. They knew this might be their last fight, and there was honor in that. The English advanced in silence, their lines stretched wide, the glint of spears like a field of frost. When they drew close, a horn sounded low, steady, ancient. Then came the first clash. The English struck the Norse wall with a cry that shook the air. Spears thrust, shields shattered, men fell and rose again. The ground turned slick beneath their boots. The sun climbed higher, beating down upon the helmets, upon the blood, upon the smoke that rose from the trampled grass. Harold fought among his men, his great sword cutting arcs of light through the chaos. He moved like a man possessed, not of rage, but of destiny. Each time the English pressed forward, the Norse wall bent but did not break. For hours, they held their ground, yet the heat and exhaustion began to bite. Many Norsemen had marched miles from the ships that morning, unarmored, unprepared. Their shields grew heavy, their breaths came ragged. Harold saw the weakness spreading through his ranks. He raised his sword, shouting, "Forward! Drive them back to their fields." He surged ahead, tall, unarmored, shining beneath the sun like a figure carved from legend. His men followed, roaring as they broke from the shield wall, charging into the English line. For a moment, it worked. The English reeled, pushed back under the sudden fury. Then, an arrow flew. It caught Harold in the throat, piercing just above the ring of his mail. He staggered, his sword slipping from his hand. The cry went up, "The king is down." Panic rippled through the Norse line. Some faltered, some turned, others fought harder still, as if their courage alone might hold the world together. Tostig, Harold's English ally, took command, calling for the men to rally. His banner rose high, the blue and gold of Norway still fluttering in the wind. He fought like a man who knew death well, side by side with those he had led across the sea. But the English pressed on, their discipline held, their numbers overwhelmed. Slowly, inch by inch, the Norse army was pushed back toward the river. By afternoon, the field was a storm of smoke and cries. The bridge behind them was slick with blood. When Tostig fell, struck down amid his guard, the last of the resistance began to crumble. Those who could fled toward the ships, pursued by the relentless English line. By evening, the valley was quiet again. The sun sank behind the hills, turning the sky to a deep red, as though the earth itself mourned what had been lost. Harold Godwinson stood among the fallen, silent. He had won a king's victory, but it had cost him dearly. His men were weary, his strength diminished, his heart heavy. He ordered that the surviving Norsemen be allowed to return home, carried upon their ships under oath never to raise arms against England again. Of the hundreds who had come with Harold Hardrada, only a few dozen returned across the sea. As night fell, the valley grew still. The river whispered softly over the stones, carrying away the last traces of battle. Somewhere, far to the north, the ravens of Odin circled above the empty sky, their wings black against the fading light. The age of the Vikings had ended, not with thunder or glory, but with silence. The quiet after a dream has passed. Harold Hardrada, last great king of the north, lay among his warriors beneath the English soil, and though his crown never touched his head, his story would outlast empires whispered in the sagas, remembered in the songs of those who still dreamed of the old world, where courage alone was a man's kingdom. And so the wind that had carried the dragon ships from Norway grew gentle again, turning northward, as if guiding the lost souls home. The echoes of battle faded, leaving behind only peace and the memory of a time when legends still walked among men. The king who waited for the south wind. The smoke of Stamford Bridge had barely settled when the south wind began to stir. It crept across the fields and hills, whispering through the ashes of the fallen, carrying news farther than any rider could, across valleys, over rivers, down to the sea. And by the time it reached the southern coast of England, it found another man waiting. William, Duke of Normandy, stood upon the chalk cliffs of the Cotentin Peninsula, his cloak tugged by the restless wind. Behind him, rows upon rows of ships rocked gently in the harbor, sleek, dark vessels built for one purpose. In his eyes burned patience, not doubt. For weeks he had waited, watching the channel churn with contrary winds, the waves rising against him like a living wall. The heavens themselves seemed to hold him back. Yet William was not a man who mistook delay for denial. Each morning he would climb the cliffs to watch the horizon, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind tracing every promise, every oath that had brought him to this edge of destiny. He remembered the day years before, when the English herald had sworn to him a vow upon holy relics, that when King Edward died, the throne of England would be his. Now, word had reached him that Harold had taken the crown for himself. William did not rage. He simply turned his gaze toward the grey sea and said, "Then God shall judge between us." The army he had gathered was unlike any Normandy had ever seen. Men from all corners of his duchy, knights in mail and surtoats, archers with long ash bows, spearmen hardened from campaigns in Maine and Brittany. They came not only for pay, but for promise, for the land and honor William had pledged them across the sea. At night, the campfires stretched for miles along the coast, their glow mirrored in the restless water. Horses neighed in the dark. Armor gleamed in the torchlight like silent stars fallen to earth. The ships waited, nearly 700 of them, built of oak, and bound with iron nails, their prows carved with beasts and crosses alike. All that remained was the wind, but it blew stubbornly from the north, holding them in place while the days turned colder and the harvest moons began to rise. Some began to murmur that perhaps the invasion was cursed, that God did not favor their cause. Others feared that the English, victorious in the north, would come for them before they could cross. Still, William waited. Then, in the last days of September, the wind turned. It came first as a gentle sigh, then a steady breeze, then a full southern gust that filled the sails and rippled through the banners. The ships strained at their moorings like hounds eager for the hunt. William watched the horizon once more, calm, unblinking. "The sea opens," he said. "It is time." The order spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. Men rushed to the shore, pulling at ropes, loading horses, raising sails. Priests walked among them, offering blessings, lifting crucifixes against the dawn. Before he boarded his ship, William knelt upon the sand. He pressed his hand to the earth of Normandy, feeling its weight, its strength. "If I do not return," he murmured, "let it be said, I went to claim not another man's crown, but my own destiny." Then he rose, stepped aboard his ship Mora, a gift from his Duchess, Matilda, and raised the banner of the papal blessing, white silk embroidered with a golden cross. With the tide, the fleet moved out to sea. Night fell as they crossed. The water shimmered under a full moon, silver paths stretching toward the English coast. The ship sailed in near silence, the sound of waves mingling with the low murmur of prayer. William stood at the prow of his ship, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea wind filled his cloak. Behind him, the entire army of Normandy followed, thousands of men, hundreds of ships, their torches flickering like stars scattered upon the waves. By dawn, land appeared, the cliffs of Sussex, pale and waiting. The fleet entered Pevensey Bay with the rising tide, and one by one, the ships ran ashore. Men leaped into the shallows, driving stakes into the sand, unloading horses, barrels, and armor. When the Duke's feet touched English soil, he paused for a moment, then stumbled. His men gasped. A bad omen, they thought, but William rose at once, clutching a handful of earth in his fist. "See," he said, raising it high, "by God's will, I have taken hold of England." The omen turned to cheer. The Normans built quickly. Within days, they fortified their landing ground, constructing wooden walls and towers at Pevensey. Scouts rode inland, finding no English army waiting. Harold, they soon learned, was still far to the north, resting his men after Stamford Bridge. William wasted no time. He marched eastward, toward Hastings, securing supply lines, building a second fort, and gathering food from the countryside. His discipline was strict, his orders clear. No pillaging without command, no cruelty to those who submitted. He wanted England, not burned, but inherited. Yet every night, as the fires burned across the hills, he knew the confrontation was coming. Two men, bound by an oath and divided by ambition, now sat upon the same path. and both knew that only one would leave that path alive. In London, King Harold Godwinson received the news. The message came to him by a breathless rider. The Normans had landed. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair. His face, still pale from the wounds of battle, bore the calm of a man who had accepted his fate long ago. He turned to his captains. "Then we ride again," he said. "England will not rest while another calls himself her heir." His men groaned softly, weary from weeks of fighting, yet they obeyed. They loved him not as a lord of gold, but as a leader of flesh, a man who fought beside them, who shared their bread, their storms, their silence. The army gathered once more. The roads that had carried them north now carried them south again, through the forests of Sherwood, across the fields of Wessex, over the downs where the autumn leaves turned red. Each night they slept under open sky, the fires small, the songs quiet. They marched toward Hastings, toward destiny's final crossroad. At Pevensey, William received word that Harold's army was coming. He ordered his men to prepare. The Normans sharpened blades, mended shields, and prayed. Priests moved through the ranks, blessing each knight in turn. The banner of the Golden Cross fluttered above the camp, glowing faintly in the moonlight. William slept little that night. He sat by the fire, gazing into the flames, listening to the murmur of the sea. Around him, his captains spoke in low tones of strategy, of courage, of heaven's favor. When dawn approached, William rose and looked toward the dark hills inland. Somewhere beyond them, the English king was marching, carrying the weight of his land and his fate upon weary shoulders. The wind blew softly from the south, cool and steady. It stirred the Duke's banner, lifted the sails upon the ships that had carried him here. He smiled faintly. "The wind still favors us," he said. "Tomorrow, God shall decide whose crown it truly is." And so, beneath the pale October moon, two armies approached one another, one born of the sea, the other of the soil. Between them lay the promise of a single day that would decide the course of centuries. The field of Hastings, the morning of October 14, 1066, dawned cool and pale. Mist hung low over the rolling hills of Sussex, drifting through the oaks and the heather like the breath of the sea. Dew clung to every blade of grass, shining faintly as the sun began to rise over the distant horizon. On a ridge called Senlac Hill, the English army formed its line. Thousands of men, housecarls, the king's hardened guard, and the furred farmers and freemen drawn from the shires, stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a living wall of shields and courage. Their leader, Harold Godwinson, moved among them quietly, speaking few words. He wore a plain mail hauberk, his helmet rimmed with iron, his eyes dark with fatigue and resolve. He had fought 2 great battles in the span of a single month. He had marched nearly the length of his kingdom twice. Yet he stood now, unflinching, upon the ground that would decide the fate of England. To the south, across the open valley, the Normans gathered. Rows of banners rippled in the wind, gold lions, black crosses, the blue and white of Breton knights. And at their center, beneath a standard gifted by the Pope himself, stood William of Normandy. The Duke's armor gleamed in the rising light. His horse stamped and snorted, its breath a pale cloud. Around him, his men murmured prayers, crossing themselves. The two armies faced one another across the field, the morning wind whispering through the grass, carrying the faint sound of distant bells from a village far away. Between them, time seemed to pause. William raised his hand, and a trumpet sounded. The Normans advanced. At first came the archers, ranks of them, bows creaking, strings drawn. Arrows hissed through the air like rain, striking against the English shield wall with dull, splintering thuds. Few found their mark. The English shields were thick, their formation tight. Then came the infantry, shouting their cries of Dexa, God help us. They surged up the slope. But the hill was steep. The English firm. The clash of steel rang out across the ridge as axes met swords, shields slammed against shields. The front lines wavered, surged, then steadied again. For hours, the battle swayed but did not break. William rode among his men, his voice cutting through the chaos, steady and sharp. He fought not with wild fury but with the cold patience of a man who understood both war and waiting. Yet the slope favored the English. Every charge broke against their wall of shields, every arrow seemed swallowed by the hill. Then, in the heart of the melee, a rumor spread. William was dead. Panic rippled through the Norman ranks. Men began to fall back, stumbling down the slope. Some even turned to flee toward the sea. But the rumor was false. William tore off his helmet, his face red with sweat and fury, his voice booming above the din. Look upon me, he shouted. I live, and by God's grace, I will conquer. The panic halted. The Duke spurred his horse uphill once more, rallying his knights. His courage was like a spark in dry tinder. The flame returned. By midday, the field was a storm of noise and motion. Arrows darkened the sky. The ground trembled beneath the hooves of charging horses. Again and again, the Norman cavalry surged forward, only to be hurled back by the English axes. The air reeked of iron and smoke and salt. Then, amid the din, William saw an opportunity. He ordered his men to feign retreat. The front line fell back in apparent panic, their shouts echoing through the valley. The English, thinking their enemy was broken, broke formation, and pursued. It was the mistake William had prayed for. With a sudden shout, the Norman cavalry wheeled around, crashing into the unshielded English line. The hill that had been their strength now became their trap. The English ranks split. The shield wall, the pride of Harold's army, began to crumble. The battle turned. As the sun lowered toward afternoon, both kings still fought. William, grim and relentless, pressed his advantage. Harold, weary but unyielding, gathered what remained of his guard at the crest of the hill. The fight became desperate, almost silent, not of noise, but of will. Men swung until their arms could no longer lift their blades. Blood ran down the slope, mixing with mud and fallen leaves. And then came the final storm of arrows. William ordered his archers to aim high, not at the shields, but at the sky. The arrows arced like flocks of black birds, falling upon the ridge in a deadly rain. In the confusion, one found its mark. It struck Harold in the eye. He staggered, reaching for the shaft, the world dimming around him. The hill, the men, the clamor, all blurred into shadow. He fell where he stood, and his housecarls fought to the last, forming a ring around their fallen king. The Norman knights broke through. The English standard fell. By dusk, the hill of Senlac was silent. Only the wind remained, blowing across the dead and dying, carrying the last breath of one age into the dawn of another. William stood among the fallen as the light faded. His armor was dented, his sword nicked, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked to the sky, where the clouds glowed faintly with the last gold of sunset. England lay before him, quiet now, but vast and waiting. He did not smile. He only whispered, "So ends the promise, and begins the burden." The priests came and prayed. The banners were lowered. The Duke of Normandy, who had waited for the south wind, was now William the Conqueror. That night the campfires burned low. The men spoke softly, their voices weary. In the distance, wolves howled across the darkening hills. William sat by his tent, alone, his hands resting upon his knees. He listened to the sea wind, the same wind that had once carried him across the channel, and now whispered through the trees of a foreign land. He thought of the men who had fallen, friend and foe alike, and knew the world had changed forever. The old age of Viking and Saxon was gone. The new age of Norman rule had begun. The stars came out, sharp and cold above the English sky, and somewhere beyond them, the spirit of Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking, drifted upon the wind, carrying his saga into legend. Thus, upon the fields of Hastings, one dream ended, and another began, the dream of kings who would rule by sword and crown, yet forever chase the peace that power could never bring. The crown and the cross the morning after Hastings was heavy with fog. The battlefield lay quiet, veiled in a ghostly mist that clung to broken shields and fallen banners. Ravens wheeled above the ridge, their dark wings beating softly in the pale light. The wind carried the faint, metallic scent of battle still, though the fight had ended hours before. Among the quiet dead, men moved like shadows. Normans searching for their wounded, English farmers come to find their sons. Every step stirred the dew and the ash, the mingled trace of glory and grief. On the hilltop where the English standard had fallen, William stood silent. He did not speak, nor did he smile. Victory had been won, but it came with a weight far heavier than his armor. The land stretched before him, foreign yet faded. England was his now, by blood, by blade, by God's uncertain mercy. He looked to the sky, where the sun struggled through the fog, and whispered a prayer he half believed. In that moment, the conqueror seemed less a king than a pilgrim standing at the edge of his destiny. Word of Harold's death spread swiftly through England. The people whispered it with disbelief at first, then sorrow, then fear. In London, church bells tolled, not in celebration, but in mourning. The last English king had fallen, and with him, the old world seemed to crumble. William advanced slowly, not as a raider, but as a ruler, who knew that power must be taken, then tamed. His army marched through the countryside, careful but unrelenting. Villages offered tribute, monasteries sent messengers bearing gifts, and one by one, the English nobles swore fealty or fled. Winter crept close, and with it came hunger and unease. The Norman soldiers built camps in the damp earth, their tents flickering with the dim light of torches. Above all, William España, the white cross on a field of blue, fluttered in the cold wind, its edges singed by the firelight. When William entered London, the city did not cheer. Its people lined the streets in silence, heads bowed, eyes downcast. The old capital of the Saxons, rich with smoke and sorrow, watched a new master ride through its gates. He came not with trumpets, but with a procession of priests. Before him walked monks bearing holy relics, and behind him marched knights with swords sheathed and banners lowered. William had learned long ago that faith could rule hearts where swords could not. In Westminster Abbey, on Christmas Day of 1066, the crown of England was placed upon his head. The chant of priests echoed beneath the high, cold arches, mingling Latin prayers with the murmur of English onlookers. Yet even as he knelt, the sound of steel filled the air. Norman guards, fearing unrest, drew their blades when a fire's crackle echoed too loudly. Panic rippled through the congregation. Some fled, others shouted. William rose amid the confusion, the golden crown gleaming in the candlelight. he did not flinch. His voice was calm, his face unreadable. "Let there be peace," he said, though peace would not come easily. In the months that followed, William ruled with both mercy and iron. He rewarded loyalty with land and titles, yet crushed rebellion with unrelenting force. Castles rose across the countryside, cold, gray sentinels of stone that would forever change the English landscape. The Normans brought their language, their laws, their faith, and their hunger for order. The English, still raw from defeat, endured in quiet resentment. Fields were plowed under new masters, churches rebuilt in Romanesque stone, and a foreign tongue began to mingle with the old Saxon words of the people. Yet William was not blind to the cost. At night, he often sat alone by the hearth, the crown heavy upon his brow, listening to the wind beyond the tent walls. He had won a kingdom, but in doing so, had inherited its ghosts. He ordered a great church to be built upon the site of Hastings, an offering to God for victory, and perhaps a quiet penance for the blood it had cost. The monks who came to bless the ground wrote of him as a man torn between faith and fate, between conquest and conscience. Sometimes, when the torches burned low, he would remember the faces of those who had stood against him. Harold, proud and fierce, the English warriors who had fought until the end. He did not mock them in memory. In his own way, he honored them, for they had shown the courage he most respected, the courage to stand firm, even when the world turned against them. But kings do not live in memory alone. There were rebellions to crush, oaths to enforce, and borders to guard. In the north, the fires of revolt flared again and again. William's patience wore thin. He marched north with sword and flame, laying waste to the land in what history would call the harrying of the north. Villages burned, crops were destroyed, and winter came cruelly to those who survived. It was said that even the rivers ran dark with ash. When spring returned, the north lay silent, subdued, but scarred. William's heart hardened, as all rulers' hearts do when the crown grows heavier than their faith, and yet, amid all his wars and decrees, the cross remained ever before him. The priests who traveled with his army reminded him that kings ruled by divine will, and that every act of conquest must serve heaven's purpose. He listened, but in his private hours, he wondered if heaven's voice spoke only through silence. In dreams, he saw the field of Hastings again, the arrow in Harold's eye, the hills slick with rain and blood. He saw the faces of men who had fallen at his command, and he heard the distant roar of the sea beyond the cliffs. He would wake in the dark, breathing hard, the fire dying beside him. For a moment, the crown felt not like gold, but like iron. Years passed. Castles multiplied, sons grew to men, and the new order took root. The English tongue bent beneath Norman rule, reshaped by time, until both conqueror and conquered spoke a language neither fully their own. In that strange merging, a new England was born, one that belonged to neither Saxon nor Norman alone, but to both, bound together by memory and need. And William, the man who had come as invader, found himself less a destroyer and more a steward of what he had taken. He built abbeys and granted lands to the church. He sent scribes to record every holding, every acre, every ox and field in a great survey that would become known as the Doomsday Book, the final reckoning of all that England contained. To his court he brought scholars and monks, men who could write what others only spoke, to preserve the story of his reign in ink that would outlast the fleeting triumphs of war. As his hair turned gray and his strength began to fade, William traveled less. The sea, which had once carried his armies, he now watched from the safety of stone walls. He spoke often of Normandy, of the green fields of home, and the soft bells of Cannes. England, for all its riches, had never truly felt like home. It was a prize, not a belonging. And in quiet moments, he would look upon the golden cross that hung above his bed, and whisper that all kings, no matter how powerful, are but pilgrims, walking toward the same silence. When he died in 1087, the land mourned with a strange and divided heart. Some wept for a conqueror who had brought order from chaos. Others wept for the old ways that would never return. He was buried far from the fields of Hastings, yet the wind that swept over that hill seemed to carry his name still, not in anger, not in praise, but in the hush of time itself. And so the crown passed on, the cross remained, and England endured forever, shaped by the man who came from across the sea, and by the long shadow his victory cast upon its soul. The Sons of Iron, the bells that tolled for William the Conqueror's death, echoed far beyond the stone walls of Cannes. They drifted over the fields of Normandy, across the grey waters of the Channel, and into the misty valleys of England, a land that had known his hand in both blessing and burden. In the shadow of his passing, the kingdom he forged stood uneasy. His sons, born of the same iron will, but tempered by different hearts, now looked upon one another with wary eyes. For though William had conquered England, he had not conquered the rivalries within his own blood. Robert, the eldest, called Curthos for his short legs and proud temper, had long felt wronged by his father. Ambitious yet reckless, he was a man of warmth and fury, generous with his laughter, quicker still with his sword. Normandy was his birthright, and he claimed it now as his due. William Rufus, the second son, was bold and cunning, with eyes that gleamed like steel in the firelight. England was his inheritance, the throne his father had carved from chaos. Yet in his heart burned not devotion, but defiance. And Henry, the youngest, quiet and patient, watched both of them with a scholar's mind. He had little land, fewer titles, and yet the calm certainty of one who understood that time itself could be an ally. Thus, as the crown passed from father to sons, the peace of the realm trembled once more. In Normandy, Robert's rule began with promise and noise. Feasts, tournaments, the laughter of lords who thought him their friend. But friendship, among men who dream of power, is as fragile as frost in sunlight. His generosity emptied his coffers, his temper thinned his alliances, and soon, whispers began to rise. The great duchy of Normandy, once the proud heart of conquest, grew restless beneath his uneven hand. Across the Channel, William Rufus ruled England with sharper discipline. His father's castles still stood like teeth across the land, and he strengthened them further, a chain of stone and fear that bound the kingdom in order. He was not loved, but he was obeyed. He wore the crown as a soldier wears armor, not for glory, but for defense. Under his command, the forests grew thick with royal game, guarded by harsh laws that forbade the common folk to hunt. And in the dim halls of Winchester and Westminster, he filled his court with men who spoke in Norman French and dreamed only of gold. Yet beneath the glitter of his rule, the old England still breathed, in the monasteries where Saxon monks whispered their prayers, in the meadows where peasants still spoke their mother tongue, and in the hearts of those who remembered a time before the conqueror's sons. Henry, meanwhile, waited and watched. He traveled between Normandy and England, lending his counsel, offering calm words where his brothers raised swords. He understood that crowns are rarely won by force alone. They are claimed by patience, by knowing when to speak, and when to wait for the silence that follows. It was said that he carried always a book of laws, a relic of the old kings who had ruled before his father came. He studied it by candlelight, tracing each word with the care of a man who wished to understand power not as a weapon, but as a weight. Years passed, and the brothers' rivalry deepened. Robert demanded aid from England, claiming the right of kinship. William Rufus refused, claiming the right of kingship. The two realms that William the Conqueror had joined by his sword now drifted apart, like ships caught in opposite tides. And yet, even as they quarreled, fate worked in quiet ways. In the spring of 1088, rebellion rose in England. Barons who had once sworn loyalty now turned their cloaks, calling for Robert to cross the sea and claim his father's throne. The land bristled with unrest, but William Rufus moved swiftly, riding hard through rain and mud, rallying his soldiers not with promise, but with command. He crushed the rebels before Robert could sail, his victory as ruthless as it was complete. When the fires died, his crown sat more firmly than before, though at its base, the cracks of family betrayal still ran deep. It was said that William Rufus loved the hunt more than the throne. He built great lodges in the New Forest, wild ancient woodlands, where deer wandered beneath canopies of oak and ash. There, away from court and council, he found a strange peace in the chase. Yet the forest that soothed him would one day take him as well, for fate has a quiet way of finishing the stories that kings begin. On a summer's day in 1100, William rode into the New Forest with his companions. The air was clear, the sunlight thick through the leaves. They hunted from dawn, laughter echoing through the trees. As evening fell, an arrow flew, sharp, sudden, and true. It struck the king in the chest. No one ever learned who loosed it. Some said it was an accident, others whispered of plots and vengeance. The truth was swallowed by the forest that day, and only the rustle of branches carried its secret. William Rufus fell upon the moss, the light fading from his eyes. The king who had ruled through fear met death in silence. His companions fled, terrified, but one man remained, Henry, his younger brother. Henry knelt beside the fallen king, his face calm, his thoughts hidden. In the stillness of that fading day, he looked upon the crown that had slipped from William's brow, and saw not grief, but opportunity. He took the royal ring, the symbol of rule, and rode hard for Winchester through the night. The hooves of his horse thundered across the fields, carrying with them the future of a kingdom. By dawn, he had claimed the treasury and secured the support of the church. By sunset, he was proclaimed king. The youngest son of William the Conqueror, the quiet one, the scholar, had seized the crown through speed and resolve. The era of Henry, called Beauclerc for his learning, had begun. Under Henry's rule, England changed again. He sought to heal the divisions that had festered since his father's time. He spoke not only in Norman French but also in English, honoring the language of the land he ruled. He reissued the old laws, softened the harshest taxes, and restored the rights of the church. Yet beneath his calm face lay the same steel that ran in his father's blood. When rebellion came, he crushed it without hesitation. When peace reigned, he strengthened it with wisdom. He married Matilda, a princess descended from the old Saxon kings, a union meant to bind two peoples into one. And for a while, it seemed to work. England grew quieter, more stable, its scars slowly fading beneath the slow rhythm of prosperity. But even kings who rule with wisdom cannot command fate. In the year 1120, Henry's only son, the heir to his throne, drowned when his ship, the White Ship, sank in the dark waters of the Channel. When word reached Henry, He did not speak. He turned his face away and wept, not as a king, but as a father. From that night onward, it was said, the light in his eyes dimmed. He ruled on for years, his mind as sharp as ever, but his heart forever wounded. And when at last he died in 1135, the crown once more became a cause of conflict. His daughter Matilda, rightful heir, faced rivals who would not bow to a woman's rule. And so began another storm, a war that would shake the land her grandfather had conquered. And as the bells tolled again across England, the sons of iron were gone, leaving behind a kingdom forged by sword, by sorrow, and by the long shadow of their father's name. The Lady and the Lionless Sea lay quiet that winter morning, its grey waves whispering against the southern shores of England. In the cold dawn light, the realm seemed to hold its breath. King Henry Beauclerc was dead, and with him had passed the last clear order of his line, in Winchester and Westminster alike. The crown lay uncertain, its weight waiting to be claimed. But unlike times before, this time, the rightful heir was not a prince of war, but a princess. Her name was Matilda, daughter of Henry, granddaughter of the Conqueror. She had been raised to understand the strength and solitude that power demands. From childhood, she was taught to speak like a queen, to think like a ruler, and to endure like a soldier. Her father had named her heir long before his death, had made the nobles swear oaths of loyalty to her cause. Yet in the secret hearts of many, unease lingered. For the thought of a woman ruling alone, commanding armies, issuing decrees, wearing the Iron Crown was still a thing few men could imagine, and among those few, one man saw opportunity. Stephen of Blue, Henry's nephew, was a man of easy charm and swift ambition. He had been raised at the English court, favored by Henry himself, and his smile could win hearts as easily as his sword won battles. When news of the king's death reached him across the channel, Stephen moved quickly, faster than Matilda, faster than conscience. He rode to Winchester, where the treasury waited, and claimed the crown before winter's frost had even melted from the stones. The nobles, weary of uncertainty, accepted him. The church blessed him, and England, always hungry for a strong hand, bowed its head once more. When Matilda heard the news, her silence was colder than the sea. She had lost her crown before it was ever placed upon her brow, but she would not forget. Years passed. Stephen ruled, but his throne was never at peace. The land trembled with unrest. The barons grew bold, castles rose like weeds, and the roads filled with the scent of smoke and steel. The common folk, caught between rival lords, whispered a bitter name for those years. The anarchy. For the realm that had once been united under the Conqueror's hand was now a patchwork of feuds and sieges. And far across the channel, in the court of Anjou, Matilda watched it all, waiting for her moment to return. Her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, was a man of fierce pride and restless energy, younger than Matilda, but loyal in his own hard way. He wore a sprig of golden broom in his cap, the emblem of his house, and from it the line of Plantagenet would one day take its name. Together, they raised an army. In 1139, Matilda crossed the channel, landing upon the same shores where her grandfather had once arrived as a conqueror. The storm had returned, not led by a warrior king this time, but by a woman whose courage was carved from loss and defiance. Her first allies were few, but steadfast. Chief among them was her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, a man of calm strength, who fought not for ambition, but for loyalty. They fortified castles in the west, Bristol, Gloucester, and Devizes, and from there, Matilda began her long struggle to reclaim her birthright. Stephen moved swiftly to crush her, but fate favored her in ways no blade could predict. At Lincoln, in 1141, his army met hers in open battle. The fighting was fierce, steel clashing on frozen ground, shouts echoing beneath gray winter skies. Stephen fought like the knight he was, brave and unyielding, but he was surrounded and taken prisoner. When news spread that the king was captured, England seemed, for a moment, to tilt toward Matilda's cause. In Winchester, the bells rang for her arrival. She was addressed as Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English. At last, the crown was within reach, yet even victory can falter under pride. Matilda, accustomed to the respect of emperors and nobles, carried herself with the dignity she had been born to, but to many, her pride seemed like arrogance. When she entered London to be crowned, she found not cheers, but cold stares. She refused petitions, dismissed flatterers, and spoke as a ruler rather than a supplicant. The same firmness that had sustained her through exile now turned her court against her. And just as swiftly as fortune had lifted her, it betrayed her again. The people of London rose in riot. Bells tolled, streets filled with shouts, and Matilda was forced to flee the city before the crown could touch her brow. The war dragged on. Stephen was freed and reclaimed his throne. Matilda withdrew to the west, her cause bruised but unbroken. For years, England knew no rest. Towns burned, fields lay barren, and travelers spoke of ghosts on the roads. It was a time of waiting, watching, and enduring. Matilda's fire did not fade, but her strength turned inward toward her son. Henry, he was a boy of bright eyes and quick wit, born of her ambition and Geoffrey's fierce blood. She saw in him the continuation of all she had fought for, not vengeance, but legacy. Under her guidance, he learned the ways of war and statecraft, of patience and power. The boy grew into a man who listened as much as he spoke, who watched before he struck. By the time he reached his 20s, even Stephen began to sense the tide shifting. The aging king, weary of rebellion and loss, looked upon the young Henry of Anjou and saw the future that could no longer be denied. In 1153, after nearly 15 years of unrest, an agreement was reached. Stephen would remain king until his death, but Henry would succeed him, not through bloodshed, but through peace. And when Stephen died the following year, the crown passed at last to Matilda's son. Henry Plantagenet, the first of his name, was crowned King of England. The dream that Matilda had carried through storm and exile, through betrayal and battle, had finally found its place in the hands of her child. Matilda never wore the crown herself, but she had shaped the destiny of those who did. In her later years, she returned to Normandy, where the Seine flowed quietly beneath gray skies, and Abbey stood wrapped in mist. She ruled her estates with grace and order, her letters filled with wisdom rather than regret. When she died, it was said the bells of Rouen tolled, not for loss, but for honor. For though her reign had been denied, her legacy endured in the blood of her son, and in the roots of a dynasty that would rule England for centuries to come. And in the memory of those who whispered her story, Matilda remained what she had always been, not a conqueror, but a survivor. A queen in all but name. And so the storm quieted at last. But beyond the horizon, new winds were gathering, for the young Henry, who now wore the crown, would soon face trials of his own, as love, ambition, and rebellion began to weave a new chapter in the endless tale of kings and hearts. The Lion and his queen. The winter wind swept softly over the white cliffs of England, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea and the quiet promise of a new age. The anarchy had ended. The land that had known fire and division for 2 long decades now rested beneath the calm but watchful rule of a new king, Henry II, son of Matilda, grandson of the Conqueror. He was young, not yet 30, but already his name carried the weight of legend. Those who had seen him ride spoke of his restless energy, of the sharp intelligence that glimmered behind his eyes. He was a king of movement, never still, never satisfied, forever chasing the shape of an empire that might match the greatness of his ambition. And at his side stood a woman as extraordinary as he, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Beauty had filled poems long before Henry ever wore a crown. She was the duchess of a land rich in sunlight and song, where vineyards stretched across the hills of France and troubadours sang of love and longing. Before Henry, she had been Queen of France, wife to King Louis VII. But her spirit had never bent easily to others. Where Louis was pious and cautious, Eleanor was bold and radiant, drawn to art, to music, and to the thrill of life itself. Their marriage had withered like a flower kept in shadow, and when it ended, she crossed paths with Henry, fiery, clever, and full of life's raw energy. They were, in every way, a storm made flesh. Their union bound to great realms. England and Aquitaine, forming a dominion that stretched from the highlands of Scotland to the sun-drenched valleys of Gascony. Never before had an English crown held such vast power over French soil. Together, they ruled an empire not of one heart, but of many. England gave them its order and law. Aquitaine gave them its grace and splendor. Henry ruled with an iron mind. He rebuilt the justice of the realm, restoring what war had broken. He walked among his judges and clerks as an equal, drafting new laws, listening to petitions, and demanding that even the powerful bow before the rule of law. He was known to say that justice should flow as freely as the rivers, touching both king and peasant alike. He moved through his kingdom endlessly, never content to stay in one palace for long. His courtiers joked that the king had legs of iron, for his energy seemed boundless. He would rise before dawn, attend to petitions, ride for miles, and still be arguing cases by candlelight. He loved power. Yes, but more than that, he loved the act of ruling, of shaping the world with his will. Eleanor, meanwhile, brought to court the brilliance of Aquitaine's culture. She surrounded herself with poets, scholars, and troubadours who sang of chivalry and devotion, weaving the ideals of courtly love that would echo through Europe for centuries. Under her influence, the cold stone halls of England began to soften, not in strength, but in spirit. There were music and laughter again, color and art. The court of Henry and Eleanor became a stage for intellect and imagination, where kings and queens debated not only laws and wars, but the meaning of honor and love. Yet behind that shining surface, shadows grew. For though they were matched in brilliance, Henry and Eleanor were also mirrors of each other's pride. Their tempers, once bound by passion, began to clash like flint and steel. Henry's restlessness led him to rule with a heavy hand, and Eleanor, who had never been content to be merely a wife, found her voice dimmed beneath his command. She bore him 8 children, sons and daughters, who would shape the fate of empires. But each birth seemed to drive them further apart. Henry's heart strayed toward others. His affection for a young woman named Rosamond Clifford became legend. Fair Rosamond, the hidden rose of the court. The stories tell that he built for her a labyrinth at Woodstock, a garden of secrecy and song. And though the truth of those tales has long blurred into myth, they carry the ache of a queen's wounded pride. Eleanor, proud and fierce, withdrew to her beloved taking her sons with her. There, the seeds of rebellion began to stir. Their sons were princes of fire, each one a reflection of the parents who had made them. Henry, the eldest, called the young king, was crowned while his father still lived, yet given no true power. His charm made him beloved, but his pride made him restless. Richard II was fierce and noble, a warrior in spirit even as a boy. Geoffrey, clever and cunning, moved through politics like a cat in shadow. And John, the youngest, watched and waited, his eyes sharp and hungry. Henry sought to bind them all under his rule, but in doing so, he bound their anger as well. Eleanor, from her court in Poitiers, listened to their grievances. She knew their father's temper, his impatience, his need to command every heart that beat near his, and in the quiet halls of Aquitaine, she became once more what she had always been, a ruler in her own right. When her sons rose in rebellion, it was said her words lit the first spark. The year was 1173, when the storm broke. Henry's sons, allied with the King of France, turned their banners against their father. Across the Angevin lands, castles flared with battle. Brothers fought beside foreign kings, and the great empire trembled. Henry's wrath was terrible. His armies crushed the rebellion one by one, his sons driven to their knees. And when he discovered Eleanor's part in their treachery, his heart hardened beyond forgiveness. He ordered her seized and imprisoned. For 16 long years, she lived in quiet captivity, moving from castle to castle, a queen in name only. Yet even in silence, her presence lingered. She became a legend, the captive queen whose strength could not be broken, whose sons carried her will like a torch dot. As time passed, the tides of fate turned once more. Henry, worn by years of rule and burdened by betrayal, began to fade. His beloved son, the young king, died before him. Geoffrey fell soon after, and when word reached Henry that his son, Richard, his lion-hearted heir, had risen again against him, the old king's strength broke at last, in 1189. He died at Chinon, whispering the names of those who had loved him once, and turned against him in the end. When Eleanor was freed from captivity, she was no longer the radiant queen of poets and courts, but she was still a woman of steel. She crossed the land to stand beside her surviving son Richard, the Lionheart. Together they brought peace to the realm, and as the crown was placed upon his brow, she stood silently beside him, the mother of a king once more. It was said that Richard kissed her hand before all the court and whispered, "From you, I learned what it is to rule." And in that moment, the long story of love, pride, and endurance between Henry and Eleanor seemed to find its quiet end. Eleanor would live many more years longer than any of her sons, but John, she would see Richard depart for crusade, hear the songs of his glory carried across Europe, and feel again the ache of distance that had followed her all her life. When at last her own time came, she was buried in the Abbey of beside the husband she had once defied and the son she had guided to greatness. There, beneath the cool stone of the church, their effigies still lie, Henry with his book, Eleanor with her crown, both carved in peaceful repose. And, though their lives had been a storm, their resting place is calm, a reminder that even the fiercest hearts may find quiet at the end. Thus ended the age of the lion and his queen, an age of fire and passion, of law and rebellion, of hearts too strong to yield, and dreams too great to die but beyond their tombs. Another story was stirring the tale of their sons, of crusades, of captivity, and of a king who would become legend beneath a foreign sun. The lion and his queen. The winter wind swept softly over the white cliffs of England, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea and the quiet promise of a new age. The anarchy had ended. The land that had known fire and division for 2 long decades now rested beneath the calm but watchful rule of a new king, Henry II, son of Matilda, grandson of the Conqueror. He was young, not yet 30, but already his name carried the weight of legend. Those who had seen him ride spoke of his restless energy, of the sharp intelligence that glimmered behind his eyes. He was a king of movement, never still, never satisfied, forever chasing the shape of an empire that might match the greatness of his ambition. And at his side stood a woman as extraordinary as he, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Beauty had filled poems long before Henry ever wore a crown. She was the duchess of a land rich in sunlight and song, where vineyards stretched across the hills of France and troubadours sang of love and longing. Before Henry, she had been Queen of France, wife to King Louis VII. But her spirit had never bent easily to others. Where Louis was pious and cautious, Eleanor was bold and radiant, drawn to art, to music, and to the thrill of life itself. Their marriage had withered like a flower kept in shadow, and when it ended, she crossed paths with Henry, fiery, clever, and full of life's raw energy. They were, in every way, a storm made flesh. Their union bound to great realms. England and Aquitaine, forming a dominion that stretched from the highlands of Scotland to the sun-drenched valleys of Gascony. Never before had an English crown held such vast power over French soil. Together, they ruled an empire not of one heart, but of many. England gave them its order and law. Aquitaine gave them its grace and splendor. Henry ruled with an iron mind. He rebuilt the justice of the realm, restoring what war had broken. He walked among his judges and clerks as an equal, drafting new laws, listening to petitions, and demanding that even the powerful bow before the rule of law. He was known to say that justice should flow as freely as the rivers, touching both king and peasant alike. He moved through his kingdom endlessly, never content to stay in one palace for long. His courtiers joked that the king had legs of iron, for his energy seemed boundless. He would rise before dawn, attend to petitions, ride for miles, and still be arguing cases by candlelight. He loved power. Yes, but more than that, he loved the act of ruling, of shaping the world with his will. Eleanor, meanwhile, brought to court the brilliance of Aquitaine's culture. She surrounded herself with poets, scholars, and troubadours who sang of chivalry and devotion, weaving the ideals of courtly love that would echo through Europe for centuries. Under her influence, the cold stone halls of England began to soften, not in strength, but in spirit. There were music and laughter again, color and art. The court of Henry and Eleanor became a stage for intellect and imagination, where kings and queens debated not only laws and wars, but the meaning of honor and love. Yet behind that shining surface, shadows grew. For though they were matched in brilliance, Henry and Eleanor were also mirrors of each other's pride. Their tempers, once bound by passion, began to clash like flint and steel. Henry's restlessness led him to rule with a heavy hand, and Eleanor, who had never been content to be merely a wife, found her voice dimmed beneath his command. She bore him 8 children, sons and daughters, who would shape the fate of empires. But each birth seemed to drive them further apart. Henry's heart strayed toward others. His affection for a young woman named Rosamond Clifford became legend. Fair Rosamond, the hidden rose of the court, the stories tell that he built for her a labyrinth at Woodstock, a garden of secrecy and song. And though the truth of those tales has long blurred into myth, they carry the ache of a queen's wounded pride. Eleanor, proud and fierce, withdrew to her beloved taking her sons with her. There, the seeds of rebellion began to stir. Their sons were princes of fire, each one a reflection of the parents who had made them. Henry, the eldest, called the young king, was crowned while his father still lived, yet given no true power. His charm made him beloved, but his pride made him restless. Richard II was fierce and noble, a warrior in spirit even as a boy. Geoffrey, clever and cunning, moved through politics like a cat in shadow. And John, the youngest, watched and waited, his eyes sharp and hungry. Henry sought to bind them all under his rule, but in doing so, he bound their anger as well. Eleanor, from her court in Poitiers, listened to their grievances. She knew their father's temper, his impatience, his need to command every heart that beat near his. And in the quiet halls of Aquitaine, she became once more what she had always been, a ruler in her own right. When her sons rose in rebellion, it was said her words lit the first spark. The year was 1173, when the storm broke. Henry's sons, allied with the King of France, turned their banners against their father. Across the Angevin lands, castles flared with battle. Brothers fought beside foreign kings, and the great empire trembled. Henry's wrath was terrible. His armies crushed the rebellion one by one, his sons driven to their knees. And when he discovered Eleanor's part in their treachery, his heart hardened beyond forgiveness. He ordered her seized and imprisoned. For 16 long years, she lived in quiet captivity, moving from castle to castle, a queen in name only. Yet even in silence, her presence lingered. She became a legend, the captive queen whose strength could not be broken, whose sons carried her will like a torch. As time passed, the tides of fate turned once more. Henry, worn by years of rule and burdened by betrayal, began to fade. His beloved son, the young king, died before him. Geoffrey fell soon after, and when word reached Henry that his son, Richard, his lion-hearted heir, had risen again against him, the old king's strength broke at last. In 1189, he died at Chinon, whispering the names of those who had loved him once, and turned against him in the end. When Eleanor was freed from captivity, she was no longer the radiant queen of poets and courts, but she was still a woman of steel. She crossed the land to stand beside her surviving son Richard, the Lionheart. Together they brought peace to the realm, and as the crown was placed upon his brow, she stood silently beside him, the mother of a king once more. It was said that Richard kissed her hand before all the court and whispered, "From you, I learned what it is to rule." And in that moment, the long story of love, pride, and endurance between Henry and Eleanor seemed to find its quiet end. Eleanor would live many more years longer than any of her sons, but John, she would see Richard depart for crusade, hear the songs of his glory carried across Europe, and feel again the ache of distance that had followed her all her life. When at last her own time came, she was buried in the Abbey of beside the husband she had once defied and the son she had guided to greatness. There, beneath the cool stone of the church, their effigies still lie, Henry with his book, Eleanor with her crown, both carved in peaceful repose. And, though their lives had been a storm, their resting place is calm, a reminder that even the fiercest hearts may find quiet at the end. Thus ended the age of the lion and his queen, an age of fire and passion, of law and rebellion, of hearts too strong to yield. and dreams too great to die but beyond their tombs. Another story was stirring the tale of their sons, of crusades, of captivity, and of a king who would become legend beneath a foreign sun. The fall of the Angevin Empire, the death of Richard the Lionheart left a silence across England and her vast dominions, a silence that felt heavy, uncertain, and filled with the echoes of what had once been greatness. The Lionheart's brilliance had burned so fiercely that those who followed him were left to walk in his shadow, and now, that shadow stretched across a crumbling empire. The Plantagenet dominion, the Angevin Empire, as it was called, had been one of the grandest creations of the medieval world. From the cold coasts of Normandy to the rolling fields of Anjou, from the castles of Aquitaine to the bustling ports of England, it was a realm that spanned much of Western Europe. But it was also a fragile empire, stitched together by ambition and force rather than unity or peace. And with Richard gone, those stitches began to tear. The throne of England passed to his younger brother, a man very different from the John, called Lackland since his youth because he had inherited no estates from his father, had always lived in the shadow of greater men. He was clever, resourceful, and well-read, yet his spirit lacked the nobility and fire that had made his brother a legend. John was a man who trusted few and suspected many. His reign began not with songs and celebration, but with whispers and wary glances. In the early years, John tried to hold together the far-flung empire that his father and brother had built, but almost at once, trouble stirred in France. King Philip II, the same shrewd monarch who had once crusaded alongside Richard, saw in John a chance to reclaim lands long lost to the English crown. Philip was patient, calculating, and relentless, everything John was not. While Richard had met him on the battlefield with sword and strategy, John sought to outwit him through secret deals and uneasy alliances. Yet Philip understood John's weakness, fear. He played upon it masterfully, sowing discord among John's vassals and enticing nobles in Normandy and Anjou to his side. The empire that had once stretched proudly across France began to crumble, piece by piece. Normandy, the heart of England's continental power, became the first great loss. In 1204, after a series of disastrous campaigns, John's forces retreated, and the duchy that William the Conqueror had once brought to glory slipped from English hands forever. The loss shook the realm deeply. For generations, the kings of England had been as much French as English, their mother tongue, their culture, their politics rooted across the Channel. Now that link was broken. The empire that had bound two nations together was dissolving, and England began to look inward, becoming more itself, less a satellite of French ambition. Yet for John, this was not a moment of reflection but of bitterness. He blamed others for his failures, his barons, his generals, even fate itself. Still, John was not without strength. He ruled with energy and cunning, and his mind, though troubled, was sharp. But his methods bred resentment. To rebuild his armies and recover his losses, he imposed harsh taxes and heavy fines. He sold charters and offices, demanding coin where his father might have demanded loyalty. The nobles grew restless, the clergy uneasy, and the common folk weary. John's temper was infamous. Chroniclers tell of his rage's sudden violent outbursts that terrified even his closest advisers. He was known to gnash his teeth and curse the saints, to strike those who displeased him, and to brood in silence when anger gave way to guilt. But beneath all his flaws was a man haunted by insecurity. He had been the youngest son, the overlooked prince, and now the weight of empire crushed him more than it had ever empowered him. The one great chance for redemption came in 1214. John gathered his forces for a grand campaign to recover his lost French lands. He struck into Poitou and Anjou with a swift and daring plan. For a moment, fortune seemed to favor him, but fate, as it often did, turned cruelly. His allies faltered, his supply lines failed, and his enemies united. At the Battle of Bouvines, Philip of France dealt John a crushing defeat. The dream of restoring the Angevin Empire died that day amid the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel. When John returned to England, he found a kingdom on the edge of rebellion. His barons, proud, war-hardened men, had grown tired of his rule. They demanded reform, justice, and limits upon the crown. John resisted, for to him, kingship meant absolute authority, not compromise. Yet even kings can be cornered. By 1215, rebellion flared openly. The barons gathered their forces and seized London, forcing John into negotiation. It was at Runnymede, beside the slow, quiet waters of the Thames, that the most famous meeting of his reign took place. There, beneath summer skies and fluttering banners, king and nobles faced one another. The result was a document unlike any other in medieval Europe. The Magna Carta, the Great Charter. To John, it was humiliation. To the barons, it was victory. The charter promised that even the king was subject to law, that justice could not be sold or delayed, that free men could not be imprisoned without trial, and that taxation required consent. These words, written in the solemn Latin of the court, would echo far beyond that moment, shaping the centuries to come. But in 1215, it was little more than a fragile truce. John signed the charter but never meant to keep it. As soon as the barons dispersed, he wrote to the Pope, declaring that he had been forced into it under duress. The Pope annulled the document, and John prepared for war. The rebellion flared again, fiercer than before. Castles burned, fields were plundered, and armies marched across England. The barons, desperate for support, even invited Prince Louis of France to take the English crown. It seemed as if John's rule would end in ruin and conquest. Yet fate intervened in a quieter, more merciful way. In the autumn of 1216, while campaigning in the marshlands of eastern England, John fell ill, fevered, and exhausted. Some say it was from spoiled peaches, others that it was from despair. He made his way to Newark Castle, where his strength failed. Surrounded by a few loyal men, the weary king confessed, made peace with the church, and passed into the stillness of death. When news of his passing reached his enemies, there was no rejoicing, only relief. The storm had broken, and a child now stood in his place, his 9-year-old son, Henry. The war slowly ended, and England, bloodied and weary, began to heal. In the quiet that followed John's death, the empire he had once ruled lay in fragments. Normandy was gone, Anjou was gone, Aquitaine was slipping away. What remained was England, isolated, yet freer, more defined, more its own. Out of loss, a nation began to take shape. The Angevin Empire had been a marvel, vast, glittering, and doomed. It had been built upon conquest, sustained by ambition, and undone by pride. But its fall was not the end of England's greatness. It was the beginning of something new. The barons who had once fought for privilege would, in time, defend liberty. The charter that John had despised would become a foundation stone for law and freedom across centuries. As for John himself, history would not be kind. Chroniclers painted him as a villain, faithless, cruel, and cowardly. Legends made him the oppressor in tales of Robin Hood, the unjust king who taxed and tormented his people. Yet, beneath the layers of myth and judgment, there remains the image of a man both tragic and human, a ruler born into a world of impossible expectations, who tried to hold an empire that was already slipping through his fingers. The castles of his reign still stand, their stones weathered by time. The rivers still flow past Runnymede, whispering the memory of that fateful meeting. And somewhere in the echo of those quiet waters, one can still sense the fading footsteps of the last Angevin king, a man who lost his empire but, without knowing it, gave his people the seed of something greater. The age of empire had ended. The age of England had begun. The rise of the barons after the death of King John, the kingdom of England lay bruised but breathing like a field after storm and thunder. The people were weary of war, the land scarred by fire and siege. Yet in the hush that followed his passing, there was a fragile peace, and with it, a new beginning. A child now wore the crown, Henry, John's 9-year-old son. The boy was gentle and fair-haired, with eyes that looked upon the world not yet hardened by suspicion or pride. He was too young to rule, and so others ruled for him. Among them stood one man above all, William Marshal, the old Earl of Pembroke, once a loyal knight of Henry II, then of Richard the Lionheart, and finally the reluctant servant of King John. Marshal was a man of iron honor and quiet wisdom, a knight who had survived the shifting loyalties of 3 reigns. When John died, it was he who took the crown from the dead king's bedside and placed it upon young Henry's brow, declaring that England would not fall into ruin. "We have lost our king," he said, "but not our kingdom." It was Marshal who guided the kingdom through those first uncertain years. He reissued the Magna Carta in the boy king's name, not as a token of weakness, but as a promise of justice and stability. Slowly, the fires of rebellion cooled. The foreign prince who had invaded Louis of France withdrew, and the barons who had once fought against their king now found peace beneath the regency's fair hand. For a brief time, it seemed England might heal. But as Henry grew older, the harmony began to unravel. The young king was pious and kind, but too trusting. He believed in divine right and in the goodness of men, virtues noble in heart, yet perilous in rule. He loved beauty, music, and the sanctity of the church. His court shimmered with artists and clerics, but the lords who had fought and bled for the realm began to feel ignored. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Provence brought refinement to his court and resentment. Her family, clever and ambitious, followed her from France and soon filled royal offices. The barons grumbled that foreigners held too much power, that their king listened to whispers from Provence more than the counsel of his own people. Taxes rose again to fund wars and royal extravagance, and the kingdom's old wounds began to ache. It was in these restless years that a new spirit began to take root, the spirit of the barons, not as mere servants of the crown, but as guardians of England itself. They had once fought for their own privilege. Now, slowly, they began to speak for the realm. The Magna Carta, once a piece of parchment signed in resentment, became a symbol of something greater, the belief that even kings must rule with justice and consent. Among those who rose to lead this awakening was a man of remarkable vision and pride, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. He was French by birth, noble by bearing, and married to the king's sister, Eleanor. Yet despite his royal ties, Simon's heart burned with reform. He had fought in the king's service and seen the failings of his rule. Henry's generosity to foreign favorites, his costly wars in Poitou, in Gascony, his debts to Rome all weighed heavily upon the land. Simon, tall and stern, with a soldier's posture and a scholar's mind, became the voice of resistance. He was not content to complain in whispers. He demanded change. He demanded that the promises of the Magna Carta be honored, that the king rule not by whim, but by law. The tension grew year by year. Henry's extravagance drained the treasury, and his attempt to secure the crown of Sicily for his son enraged the barons. It was an impossible dream, one bought with borrowed gold and papal promises. When the barons refused to fund it, the king's anger flared. But the lords of England were no longer afraid. They had tasted power and principle alike, and would not be silenced. By 1258, the kingdom stood at a breaking point. A council of barons confronted Henry in Westminster, demanding reform. Under pressure, the king agreed to the provisions of Oxford, a remarkable document that placed royal administration under the supervision of a council of 15 men. For the first time, the governance of England was shared between king and realm. The old order trembled. The very idea that nobles could hold the monarch accountable was revolutionary. It was as if the Magna Carta had come alive, growing from parchment into practice. But power, once shared, is seldom peaceful. Henry soon grew weary of constraint. He longed to be free again, to rule as his father and grandfather had done, unfettered and absolute. The Pope absolved him of his oaths, and Henry cast off the provisions. Civil war loomed once more. It was Simon de Montfort who took up arms against the king, not in rebellion for his own gain, but in defense of what he saw as England's liberty. The barons rallied behind him, forming what some called the Army of God. In 1264, the two forces met near Lewes in Sussex. Henry's royal banners flew proudly above his knights, while Simon's men carried the white cross of the reformers. The battle was fierce, echoing with the crash of steel and the cries of men who fought not only for power, but for a vision of a different kingdom. When the dust cleared, Simon de Montfort stood victorious. The king was captured, and England fell into the hands of its barons. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Simon ruled in the king's name, and in 1265, he summoned a great council, not only of barons and bishops, but also knights and burgesses from the towns. It was a gathering unlike any before it, a meeting where men from across England's shires and boroughs came together to advise the realm. Historians would one day call it the first true parliament. The experiment was fragile, and Simon knew it. Power had shifted, but old loyalties and rivalries ran deep. The young Prince Edward, Henry's son, tall, determined, and fiercely intelligent, escaped his captors and rallied royalist forces. In August of that same year, the two armies met at Evesham. The storm broke at dawn. Rain swept the valley, and thunder rolled like drums of war. Simon's men, outnumbered and surrounded, fought valiantly, but the tide had turned. In the chaos of battle, Simon was cut down, his body mutilated, his cause crushed beneath the hooves of charging knights. When the battle ended, the king's banners once again rose over England. The baronial movement was defeated, yet its ideas had taken root too deeply to die. The reformers were gone, but their legacy endured. The parliament that Simon had summoned would rise again in the generations to come, shaping England's destiny in ways even he could not have imagined. King Henry lived out his remaining years under the steady hand of his son, who learned much from his father's failures and from Simon's defiance. The kingdom, though scarred, began to stabilize. The great castles of the barons still stood, proud, watchful, reminders of the age when lords and kings had wrestled for the soul of the nation. When Henry died in 1272, the crown passed peacefully to his son Edward, soon to be known as Edward Longshanks, a king of formidable will and iron purpose. Under him, England would march once more into conquest and reform, and the echoes of the barons' struggle would resound in every council and every parliament that followed. But in the quiet years that bridged the age of John and Edward, the world had changed. Kings could no longer rule alone. The lords had risen, and with them, the idea fragile yet enduring, that the voice of many could stand against the power of one. So ended the time of the first Barons' Revolution, not with the fall of kingship, but with its transformation. The seeds of freedom, watered by rebellion and sacrifice, had been planted deep in English soil, and though centuries would pass before they fully bloomed, they had already begun to grow. Edward Longshanks and the Iron Crown. When the long reign of King Henry came to its gentle close, a new dawn began to spread across England, pale at first, but gathering strength with each year. The boy who had once watched his father's realm, torn by rebellion, was now a man, tempered by war, discipline, and a deep sense of destiny. His name was Edward, tall as a tower, broad of shoulder, and solemn of gaze. The people called him Longshanks for his great height and long stride. And when he took the crown in 1272, England felt the weight of a new kind of king. Edward was no dreamer like his father, nor a poet of peace. He was a builder, a reformer, a warrior, a man who believed in the strength of order and the sanctity of law. His heart carried the memory of chaos, the rebellions, the betrayals, the endless struggle between crown and barons. He swore that England would never again be torn apart by the same. In those early years, he traveled the realm from shire to shire, like a patient physician tending the wounds of an ailing body. He summoned justices to ride the countryside, to hear the pleas of peasants and freemen alike. He reformed the courts, strengthened the coinage, and demanded that even his sheriffs answer for their conduct. The law, he said, is the king's will, but the king himself is bound by it. It was a remarkable promise, and for a time, it seemed true. Under Edward's firm hand, the realm grew orderly, prosperous, and proud. New towns flourished, trade deepened, and the rough paths of England became roads of commerce and pilgrimage. Yet peace, as always, was fragile. Beyond England's borders lay restless lands, Wales in the west, where princes still defied the English crown, and Scotland to the north, proud and untamed. To Edward, unity was not merely a dream, but a duty. A divided island was a weak one, and weakness was something he could never abide. His first challenge came from Wales. For generations, its rugged hills had sheltered men who bowed to no king, ruled by their own princes. Most notably, Llewellyn ap Griffith, the self-styled Prince of Wales. Llewellyn was bold and proud, a ruler who believed that his mountains were shield enough against any army. But Edward was not his father. He was patient, methodical, and relentless. When diplomacy failed, the iron tide of war rolled westward. Edward's armies marched into Wales with banners of red and gold, building roads and castles as they advanced, vast, stone-hearted fortresses that still stand to this day. Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech, each was a symbol of English might, planted deep in Welsh soil. By 1283, the resistance was broken. Llewellyn lay dead, betrayed and slain in a mountain glen. His brother was captured and hanged in Shrewsbury, and Wales was brought beneath the crown at last. Edward's infant son, born in Carnarvon Castle, was declared the first English Prince of Wales, a title that would echo down through the centuries. For Edward, the conquest of Wales was not merely victory, but transformation. The age of feudal lords rebelling against their king was fading. Now royal power was being forged anew, steady and absolute. Yet even as he built this New England of stone and law, a shadow crept upon its borders. In Scotland, the old king had died without an heir, leaving a land divided among claimants. Edward was called to arbitrate to decide who should wear the Scottish crown. With all the authority of a judge, he summoned the nobles of Scotland to his court. But beneath his words of counsel, there stirred a deeper ambition. He declared himself Lord Paramount of Scotland, claiming overlordship in exchange for settling their dispute. Many of the Scots accepted it in fear or weariness, but in their hearts, resentment smoldered. Edward chose John Balliol as king, a man weak enough to be controlled. For a time, the arrangement held until Edward's demands became too heavy to bear, when he ordered the Scots to supply troops for his wars in France. Their patience broke. They allied with France instead, and in 1296, Edward marched north. The storm he unleashed was terrible. Berwick was taken and sacked, its people slain by the thousands. The Stone of Scone, ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, was carried off to Westminster, and John Balliol was stripped of his crown. It seemed that Scotland too had been brought to heel, but Edward had underestimated the spirit of its people. Out of the mists of defeat rose a new figure, a man of humble birth, yet fierce and unyielding, William Wallace. Whispers of his defiance spread like wildfire, of raids in the night, of English garrisons overthrown, of banners rising once more with the thistle and the lion. In 1297, Wallace's army met the English at Stamford Bridge, and against all odds, the Scots triumphed. Edward's fury was boundless. He vowed not only to defeat the rebellion, but to erase its memory. A year later, he rode north at the head of a vast host, banners snapping in the wind, the cross of St. George gleaming above the army. At Falkirk, he crushed Wallace's forces. Yet though Wallace fled into hiding, his legend endured. When he was finally captured and brought to London in chains, the people lined the streets to see him. His death was cruel, but his courage became immortal. The years that followed were years of ceaseless striving. Edward sought to bind the realm tighter, to weave together the fabric of kingship, law, and divine order. He summoned Parliament more regularly, calling not only barons and bishops, but also knights and burgesses, giving voice to shires and towns. What Simon de Montfort had once dreamed of in rebellion, Edward now shaped in order. The governance of England was becoming a partnership, still unequal, but enduring. Yet even the mightiest kings are mortal. As Edward grew older, the fire that had driven him began to dim. His beloved wife, Eleanor of Castile, died in 1290, and his heart broke with her passing. Wherever her funeral procession paused, he raised a stone cross in her memory. The Eleanor crosses, graceful monuments of love scattered along the road from Lincoln to London. In those quiet years, the warrior king became a widower, haunted by memory. His hair turned silver, his stride slower, yet his will remained unbent. Even in old age, he could not rest. Scotland remained defiant, led now by Robert the Bruce, a man as fierce in will as Edward himself once had been. In 1307, though frail and weary, Edward mounted one final campaign to the north. The rain fell cold on the borderlands as his army advanced, and the king, ill but unyielding, pressed onward. "Carry me forward," he commanded when he could no longer ride, "that I may die in sight of Scotland." They say he breathed his last near Berg by Sands, his face turned northward, eyes fixed on the horizon. When word reached the army that the old lion was dead, a strange silence fell. Even his enemies, it was said, spoke of his greatness. Edward's body was carried to Westminster, where he was laid to rest in a dark stone tomb, inscribed with simple words, Edwardus Primus, Malleus Scotorum, the hammer of the Scots. Yet in death, his legacy was more than conquest. He had forged a kingdom bound by law, where even the king was subject to the same justice he demanded of others. He had turned the council of nobles into a parliament that gave voice, however faintly, to the common realm. He had left behind a vision of England not as a patchwork of baronies and lords, but as a nation. And though his iron hand was feared, the order he built endured. His castles still crown the hills of Wales. His statutes still echo in English law, and the parliament he summoned still sits in Westminster, speaking with the voice of a people he could scarcely have imagined. As the centuries rolled onward, kings would come and go, some wise, some cruel, some weak, some noble, but the world Edward shaped would stand. The iron crown he wore so proudly would pass from brow to brow. Yet beneath its weight would always lie the same unspoken truth, that even power must serve purpose, and even kings must answer to the realm they rule. So ended the age of England's awakening, an age of conquest and compromise, of rebellion and reform. The barons had risen, the kings had learned, and the people, slowly, had begun to find their voice. And in that slow, steady rhythm, like the toll of a distant bell beneath the night, England moved forward, not in haste, but in endurance. A kingdom once born of iron had begun to dream of liberty, and from those dreams, a nation would rise that would outlive the memory of all its kings. And so, dear listener, our long journey through the medieval world draws to its quiet end. From the humble village hearths to the iron thrones of kings, we have walked through centuries of dreams, wars, and awakenings. The echoes of those ancient lives still whisper across time of courage and sorrow, of love and power, of the fragile beauty of human hope. As the candles fade and the night deepens, may these stories guide your thoughts gently into rest. Thank you for listening to Go to Sleep, Historian, where history becomes a lullaby. If you enjoyed this story, remember to subscribe and stay with us for more soothing journeys through the forgotten pages of the past. Sleep well, and let the quiet breath of history watch over your dreams.